Hey there, welcome back. I am really glad you decided to spend part of your night here with me. Get yourself comfortable whatever way that looks for you tonight, because the story I'm about to tell you is one that has stayed with me since the day I first came across it, and I think it is gonna stay with you too. Picture being 19 years old and falling in love with exactly the wrong person. Not wrong because he was unkind or dishonest or careless with your heart. Wrong simply because of his last name. In the year 1469, a young woman in England did exactly that, and it cost her almost everything she had. Her own mother refused to let her back inside the house. A bishop was called in to decide under oath whether her marriage even counted as real. And what happened to her still explains something most of us never stop to think about. The real reason weddings still look the way they do today. Before we go further into her story, let me ask you for something small. If quiet, honest history like this is the kind of thing that helps you unwind at the end of a long day, take a second to hit subscribe and tap that like button. It really does help keep this little corner of the internet going. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight or what time it is for you right now. I love reading those. Now, turn the lights down low if you can, maybe let a fan hum quietly in the background, and settle in. Because this story starts on a quiet afternoon in the English countryside, and it does not stay quiet for long. The house still stands today if you know where to look. Oxnead Hall in Norfolk on the eastern coast of England. Quiet fields. Grey skies, a slow river slipping past the back of the property. Picture-worn stone walls, ivy climbing towards small leaded windows, and smoke curling up from a chimney that has barely stopped burning in over 500 years. In 1469, this was home to the Paston family, and their daughter Marjorie was about 19 years old, unmarried, and already tired of being talked about like a piece of land. That comparison is not an exaggeration, by the way. It is not far from the honest truth of what marriage meant. If you happened to be a young woman born into a family like the Pastons were not royalty. They were something almost more interesting than that. A family that had climbed its way up from almost nothing in just 2 generations. Marjorie's great-grandfather worked the land with his own 2 hands, described in one surviving record as nothing more than a plain farmer. By the time Marjorie was born, the family owned manor houses land across the county, and a name that opened doors most farmers' families never even saw, and they had built all of it almost entirely through marriage. Marjorie's own mother brought 9 manors into the family the day she married. Her grandmother had brought land and money of her own a generation earlier. Every single generation the Pastons had climbed a little higher, not through romance, but through paperwork. Through carefully chosen husbands and wives who happened to come with property attached. So when it was finally Marjorie's turn, the family already had a plan. They always had a plan. There was just one small problem. Marjorie had already fallen in love, and the man she loved was nowhere near anyone's plan. His name was Richard Cole, and if you want to understand exactly how carefully the Pastons had mapped out their future, you only need to hear his job title. He was the family's bailiff, the man who managed their money, collected rent from their tenants, and kept their books balanced late into the night, year after year. He had worked for the Pastons for most of Marjorie's life. He was sharp, dependable, and by every letter that survives, completely trusted with the family's fortune. He was also, in the eyes of the Pastons, nowhere near good enough to touch their daughter. Richard's own family sold goods out of a small shop. Candles, mustard, that was the whole business. And to a family as anxious about climbing the social ladder as the Pastons were, that single fact somehow mattered more than everything Richard had actually done for them. When Marjorie's brother found out about the relationship, he did not write home about heartbreak or betrayal, or even simple anger. He wrote furious that he would rather see his sister end up with nothing at all than watch her spend her days selling candles and mustard in some small market town. Sit with that for a second. A grown man was more upset about his sister marrying a shopkeeper's son than he would have been watching her marry someone cruel. or careless, or unkind, as long as that someone came from the right family. But Marjorie did not particularly care what her family considered proper, and what she did next is the reason we are still telling this story more than 500 years later. Sometime in the early 1469, Marjorie and Richard did something almost impossible to undo. Under church law at that time, you did not need a priest present or a church building or even witnesses to be legally married. All you needed were the right words, spoken freely and meant with your whole heart. It was called a vow, spoken in the present tense, and once those words left your mouth, the marriage was binding whether your family approved of it or not. Marjorie and Richard spoke those words to each other, in secret, somewhere no one else could hear. When her mother found out, the response was not sadness, it was warfare. Richard was thrown out of his position within days. Marjorie was placed under watch inside her own home. Her letters searched her movements, controlled almost completely. Her mother tried more than once to have her sent off to another household entirely somewhere far away from Richard, hoping that distance alone might quietly undo what had already been done. But there was one problem the family could not manage their way around. If Marjorie and Richard really had spoken those vows to each other, then under church law the marriage was already real whether anyone liked it or not. So the Parstons did the only thing left available to them. They marched their own daughter into the cathedral at Norwich and demanded that the church put her marriage on trial. Picture that walk for a moment. A 19-year-old woman escorted, not by friends, not by the man she loved, but by her own furious family, into a stone cathedral to be questioned by one of the most powerful men in the entire region about whether her love was legally real. The Bishop of Norwich did not go easy on her. According to the family's own surviving letters, he reminded Marjorie plainly and at length exactly who she was, what family she came from, and what she stood to lose. Comfort, reputation, the support of everyone she had ever known, if she refused to give up this marriage. He told her in front of witnesses precisely how much shame and hardship waited for her if she chose Richard over her own blood. It was by any honest measure a grown man trying to frighten a teenage girl into denying her own wedding vows. Marjorie did not deny them. When the bishop pressed her again and again to repeat the exact words she had spoken to Richard, she gave him the same answer every single time. She told him she believed in her own conscience that she was bound to Richard whatever the precise words had been. That one sentence was enough. The bishop ruled the marriage valid. And here is the part of the story that still catches people off guard every time I tell it. Winning did not save her. Her family disowned her anyway. Her own mother refused to let her back into the house. Marjorie now had a legal victory and a husband the church itself recognized as real, and she still had to go stay with a merchant family, and later inside a convent because the door to her childhood home was shut to her. Richard, meanwhile, was gone from his job entirely, until the Parstons discovered something rather inconvenient. Nobody else understood their finances the way he did. Some of the family's most important records were still in his handwriting, in his memory, in his hands. Within a short time they quietly brought him back to manage the very estate he had just been publicly shamed for wanting to marry into. Marjorie and Richard stayed married. They had 3 sons together, and as far as the surviving letters can tell us, her mother never fully forgave her. Even years later there is no record of the 2 women ever making peace. Now, here is why I wanted to open with Marjorie's story instead of a king or a queen. It would be easy to assume this kind of thing only happened to royalty. Kings marrying off daughters to secure a border, princesses shipped overseas to seal a treaty. And that absolutely happened constantly. In fact, just 1 year before Marjorie's own trial, the king's own sister crossed the sea to marry the Duke of Burgundy, in a wedding built entirely around political alliance, with not one romantic feeling required. But Marjorie was not royalty. She belonged to the minor gentry one small step above ordinary, and her family still treated her heart like a business risk. Because this was never really a royal custom. This was simply what marriage meant for almost everyone for centuries. A wedding was rarely, if ever, about two people. It was a transfer, land moved, titles moved, money moved, and the bride, more often than the groom, moved along with all of it, out of one household's ownership and into another's. Here is a detail about this story I find almost impossible to shake once you know it. Marjorie's own brother, the very one so disgusted by Richard Carle, went on to get married himself to a woman named Marjorie Bruce. Their wedding nearly fell apart, not over love, not over character, but over money, because the bride's father refused for months to raise the size of the dowry high enough to satisfy the Pastons. The bride herself had to write pleading letters, promising she would work twice as hard as any woman alive just to make the match happen anyway. The very same family that judged Richard Carle unworthy because he lacked money went on to negotiate their own son's marriage like a property sale. Nobody in that family was ever truly blind to what marriage really was. They simply preferred it to happen on their own terms, and not their daughters'. And the economics of it were never limited to families as wealthy as the Pastons. A poorer farming family, with no land to spare, might send a daughter into marriage with nothing more than a cow, a few sheep, or a small chest of coins. A family like the Pastons negotiated in manors and estates instead. The currency changed depending on how much a family owned. The underlying principle never changed at all. A daughter left her father's house worth a specific calculated amount, written down, argued over and settled, long before anyone ever said a single vow out loud. And this is where the story reaches all the way into today, into weddings you and I have actually sat through. You have probably heard the phrase giving away the bride. Maybe you've watched a father walk his daughter down an aisle and physically hand her over to the man waiting at the other end. Today we treat that moment as sentimental, sweet even. One last tender father and daughter moment before letting go. But that gesture did not begin as sentiment. It began as law. For centuries a father held direct legal authority over his daughter. In ancient Rome that authority even had its own name. Patria potestas, the power of the father absolute and rarely questioned. Marriage did not free a daughter from that authority. It simply transferred it, formally and publicly, from one man to another. The walk down the aisle was never really about love-watching love unfold. It was a literal handover of ownership, quietly dressed up over hundreds of years until only the tenderness remained visible, and the legal transfer underneath slipped completely out of memory. Which means that somewhere tonight or this weekend a father is wiping his eyes at his daughter's wedding, with absolutely no idea he's performing a piece of property law older than his own family name. History has a wonderful sense of humour that way. It keeps the gesture and quietly deletes the memo underneath. And when you really sit with all of that, Marjorie Paston's story starts to look almost gentle, compared to what else was considered completely normal in those same centuries. Because at least Marjorie got a trial, at least she got a bishop, a hearing, one real chance to speak her own words out loud and have them count for something. Not every bride in history got even that much. In fact, in some of those very same centuries we've just been talking about, plenty of families did not bother negotiating a contract, arranging a dowry or asking permission from anybody at all. They simply reached out and took what they wanted. If Marjorie's story showed you marriage as a business deal quietly worked out over dinner tables and legal documents, this next stretch of history shows you the far blunter cousin of that same idea. Because if a family could not agree on paperwork or simply did not want to bother asking, there was an entirely different option sitting right there waiting. You did not need a contract if you were willing to just take what you wanted. And for an enormous stretch of human history, an enormous number of men did exactly that. And I do not mean that as some kind of expression or a turn of phrase passed down for dramatic effect. In some of the very first stories any of us tell about how a civilization began taking a bride by force was not treated as a crime. It was treated as a triumph celebrated in art, poetry, and eventually carved into stone. Rome itself tells a story like this about its own beginning, though I want to be honest with you about how much of it is history and how much of it is legend, because historians still do not fully agree on that line. According to the story, the earliest Roman men, followers of the city's founder Romulus, had almost no women among them. So Romulus invited the neighbouring Sabine people to a grand festival complete with games and feasting. And in the middle of the celebration, at a signal from Romulus, the Roman men seized the young Sabine women and carried them off to become their wives. Historians and artists have been arguing over that story for roughly 2,000 years. Some treat it as a founding myth meant to explain and quietly excuse an old Roman marriage custom. Others believe it reflects a real much smaller incident dressed up over centuries into something grander and more heroic. Either way, what stayed constant was the message sitting underneath it. A wife did not need to be won through courtship or asked for her own consent. She could simply be taken, and Rome would still call the men who did it heroes. For what it is worth, painters spent centuries turning that exact scene into fine art. You can walk into major museums today and stand in front of enormous canvases showing that same moment, the struggling women painted in dramatic light, the men triumphant at the centre of the frame. Nobody commissioned those paintings as a warning. They were commissioned as a celebration of Roman destiny. There is another version of this same instinct played out a full millennium later on the windswept grasslands of Mongolia, and it happens to be the origin story of one of the most feared men who has ever lived. Sometime around 1159, a young woman named Holan was travelling home with her new husband, a Merkit nobleman named Chiladu, freshly married in a formal ceremony arranged by her own family. As the couple crossed the open steppe, a small hunting party spotted them from a distance. The leader of that party, a Mongol chieftain named Yesugei, decided almost on a whim that he wanted Holan for himself. Chiladu was badly outnumbered with no real chance of winning a fight. According to the oldest surviving Mongol chronicle, Holan herself urged him to run rather than die trying to defend her, pulling off her own blouse and pressing it into his hands so that he would at least carry her scent with him as he escaped. Yesugei took her as his wife that same day. Nobody on that stretch of steppe treated it as a scandal worth recording twice. It was simply how a powerful man occasionally acquired one. Holan went on to raise 5 children with Yesugei, including a son named Temujin, a boy who would grow up to unite every tribe on that same grassland under a single banner and take the name Genghis Khan. Here is the detail that stays with me the longest out of everything in tonight's story. The Merkit people never forgot what Yesugei had done to one of their own noblemen. Years later, long after Yesugei himself had died, a group of Merkit raiders rode down on young Temujin's camp, hunting for revenge for the bride stolen from their tribe a full generation earlier. And what did they take to settle that old score? Temujin's own wife, a woman named Borte, taken in almost exactly the same manner his own mother once had been. The cycle did not begin with Holan, and it certainly did not end with her. It simply kept finding a new woman to run through. Now Rome and Mongolia both give us stories carried mostly through legend and epic poetry, softened and reshaped by centuries of retelling. England, a world away, and several centuries later gives us something considerably harder to soften, a case with actual names, actual dates, and actual court records attached, showing exactly how this same instinct played out when it was aimed at one specific living woman for one very specific, very unromantic reason. Her name was Eleanor de Clare, and by the winter of 1329 she was one of the wealthiest widows in the whole of England. Eleanor had already survived more than most people face in an entire lifetime. Married at just 13 years old to a powerful nobleman named Hugh Despencer, she spent 2 decades near the centre of one of the most turbulent courts in English history. When her husband was executed in the most brutal manner, English law allowed Eleanor, only 34 at the time, was thrown into the Tower of London herself and held there for 2 long years. When she finally walked free, her land were restored to her, including Glamorgan, one of the richest lordships in the entire country. For the first time in years, Eleanor had money property, and at least on paper her freedom. She did not get to keep any of it quietly. Barely settled into her own castle at Hanley in the county of Worcestershire, Eleanor was taken. The man responsible was a baron named William Le Zouche, who strangely enough had once helped capture her own husband years earlier. Royal records from the period simply state that Eleanor was abducted from Hanley Castle, and soon afterwards she and William were married. Here is where the story becomes almost absurd in the way only real medieval bureaucracy manages to be. Around that exact same time, a completely different nobleman named John Grey came forward and insisted that he too had already married Eleanor. Royal clerks, apparently without realizing they were describing the same woman twice, recorded 2 separate abductions of Eleanor de Clare from the very same castle on the very same days, carried out by 2 different men. Sorting out the confusion took years, several church appeals, and eventually a direct ruling from the Pope himself. Historians today still argue about what actually happened to Eleanor. Was she truly abducted against her will, or did she and William quietly arrange the whole affair together, using the language of abduction to get around a king who controlled who wealthy widows were allowed to marry? Honestly, we may never know for certain. What we do know is what happened to her immediately afterward, and it tells you almost everything about what this was really about. The king seized every acre of Eleanor's land the moment news of the marriage reached the royal court. She was arrested. She was thrown back into the Tower of London a second time, accused almost unbelievably of stealing jewels from the very fortress that had once held her prisoner. She was only allowed to recover her property after agreeing to sign away the most valuable part of her inheritance to the crown, and even then only if she could somehow produce £50,000 in a single day, a sum designed to make repayment nearly impossible. Notice what was actually being punished here, not the abduction itself, her land. Cases like Eleanor's were common enough that the English crown eventually passed a law specifically written to deal with them. In 1382, a statute was introduced to punish men who abducted women, particularly wealthy heiresses and widows, for the purpose of forcing marriage and seizing their property. On paper, that almost sounds protective. Look closer at the fine print, though, and the picture turns considerably darker. Under that same law, if a woman was abducted and later appeared to accept the marriage, even under enormous pressure, even with nowhere else in the world to turn, she could lose her own inheritance too, as though simply surviving her own kidnapping made her complicit in it. One historian who studied English court records between 1150 and 1500 documented 767 separate cases of women being abducted, and that count comes from just 4 counties in England, 767, and that is only the fraction that made it into a written record at all inside a legal system built mostly to protect land, and only occasionally, almost by accident, the woman standing on top of it. It helps to know that medieval English law did not even bother separating these ideas into 2 different crimes. The word used in the court records was raptus, a single Latin term that covered both kidnapping and sexual assault, folded together almost interchangeably. Whether a woman had simply been carried off or assaulted, or both at once, the law lumped it into one broad category. A category built less to protect her body than to protect whoever technically held the rights to her marriage. Lay those first 3 stories side by side for a second, because the pattern only becomes obvious once you actually do it. Rome turned capture into a founding myth celebrated later in marble and oil paint. Mongolia turned it into the origin story of an empire retold across centuries with something bordering on pride. England turned it into a property crime, one only worth prosecuting when the right amount of land happened to be attached. 3 completely different cultures separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, and in every single one of them, whether a woman had actually said yes, sat somewhere near the very bottom of the list of things anybody thought to ask. Here is the part of this story that I think about the most, and it might surprise you. This is not something that only happened in togas and stone castles, or in the epic poems of a vanished steppe empire. In parts of Central Asia today, on land not so different from the grassland where Huolun was once taken, a strikingly similar practice still exists under the name alakachu, which translates roughly as grab and run. In Kyrgyzstan, researchers who have studied this practice for years estimate that somewhere near a third of ethnic Kyrgyz brides have at some point been taken against their will, often by a man they barely know, occasionally a complete stranger, and pressured into marriage within a matter of hours. In some rural regions, surveys have found that well over half of all local marriages began exactly this way. I want to be fair to the full picture here, because good history almost always holds 2 things at once. Some Kyrgyz families truly see a softer staged version of this custom as romantic, a playful ritual both families quietly agree to ahead of time, almost like an elopement with better choreography built in. Researchers who study the tradition closely have even pushed back on the popular belief that non-consensual bride kidnapping was ever as ancient or as widely accepted as many people in the region now assume. But underneath that softer staged version sits a much harder reality, one that cannot simply be waved away as old folklore. In 2018, a 19-year-old woman in Kyrgyzstan was taken by a man who wanted to marry her. She said no. She kept saying no. And when she would not stop refusing him, even inside a police station meant to protect her, he ended her life rather than let her walk away. Kyrgyzstan had in fact already strengthened its laws against this by then. Back in 2013, after years of pressure from women's rights groups, the government raised the maximum sentence for bride kidnapping from 3 years to as many as 10. On paper, that looked like genuine progress. In practice, enforcement barely moved at all. Even years after that law passed, researchers found that only a small fraction of reported kidnapping cases, by some counts, fewer than 1 in every 700, ever actually reached a judge. The law had changed. The everyday reality on the ground largely had not. That gap between what a country writes down as illegal and what it actually enforces might be the single most useful lesson sitting inside this whole story. A law is only ever the opening sentence of a solution. Someone still has to be willing to finish writing the rest of it. I do not share that story to end this section on something painful, though I understand if it lands that way. I share it because it draws a straight, uncomfortable line from a painted Roman legend through a 14th century English court case about land all the way into a headline from less than 10 years ago. Different centuries, different continents, completely different legal systems. And somehow underneath all of it, the exact same quiet assumption that a woman's own answer, her own yes or her own no, was never really the point of the transaction. I'm curious, honestly. When you hear a story like Eleanor's, who do you find yourself more frustrated with? The man who did the taking, or the entire legal system built around him that only seemed to care once actual property was on the line? I would love to hear your take on that down in the comments, because I still go back and forth on it myself, even after spending weeks with this story. Before we move on, it is worth sitting with one more thought. Every woman in this section of the story, whatever her century, whatever her continent, at least had the chance to grow up first. Holland was a married adult when she was taken. Eleanor de Clare had already survived a marriage, a widowhood, and years of imprisonment by the time William Le Zouche came for her. Even the young women taken today under Alakachou are at minimum old enough to walk to a well or a market on their own, which is exactly how most of them end up within reach of a kidnapper in the first place. There is one more uncomfortable thread running through almost everything we have covered so far tonight, and I saved it for last on purpose. Marjorie was 19 when she fought for her own marriage. Eleanor was 34 when she was taken from her own castle. Holland was already a married woman walking home from her own wedding when Yasugi decided he wanted her instead. Grown women, every one of them by any honest standard of their own time, but for a staggering number of brides across this same stretch of history, none of this ever happened to a grown woman at all. It happened to a child sometimes barely old enough to understand what a wedding even was, let alone what it meant to spend an entire lifetime bound to one. And unlike everything we just talked about, nobody even needed to sneak up on her, or plan a raid or drag her out of a castle in the middle of the night. Her own parents simply signed the paperwork and sent her off with the full, cheerful blessing of everyone she loved. Let's put a face to that sentence, because a fact like that deserves one, not just a statistic floating in the dark. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and by the time she turned 9 years old, she'd already stood in front of the King of England inside a formal royal chamber, crowded with advisers twice her height to be questioned about a marriage that has been arranged for her. Not consulted, examined. The court needed to know whether she would give her consent because church law at the time technically required it, even from a child barely old enough to understand what a throne even was. Margaret, raised by a mother who made absolutely certain her daughter understood her own worth on the marriage market, from an early age gave the required answer. She would later claim she'd been guided to that decision by a vision from God which tells you something about how a 9-year-old girl learns to make peace with decisions that were never really hers to make. That first marriage to a boy named John de la Pole was quietly dissolved a few years later. It hardly mattered. Margaret was one of the wealthiest heiresses in England, and wealthy heiresses did not stay unclaimed for long. By the age of 12, Margaret was married again, this time to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of the reigning king. Edmund was 24 years old. A grown man already deep in the politics and violence of a civil war, now formally bound to a child. Within months the marriage was consummated. By 13, Margaret was pregnant. Not long after that, Edmund was captured by rival forces during the fighting, thrown into a cold prison at Carmarthen Castle, and died there of illness before he ever saw his own child. So Margaret, 13 years old, widowed and heavily pregnant, was taken to Pembroke Castle, under the protection of her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor, to wait out the final months alone, in a fortress full of soldiers and strangers. The birth itself very nearly killed her. Outside the castle walls, the country was still breaking itself apart over who deserved to sit on its throne. Inside, in a cold stone room lit by little more than candlelight, a girl who was herself barely more than a child fought through a labour no one around her quite knew how to manage. Her body, still a child's body in almost every meaningful way, was simply not ready for what it was being asked to do. The labour was long and violent. Margaret survived. Her son survived. But by most historical accounts, something inside her did not. She would go on to marry twice more in her life, and never carried another pregnancy again. One clergyman who knew her later in life called it something bordering on a miracle that a baby had come safely from, in his words, so small a person. That baby grew up to become King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, which means the entire royal house that gave England Henry VIII and Elizabeth I and 4 generations of some of the most consequential rulers in English history traces itself back to a body that had not yet finished growing. I want to sit with that for one more moment before we move on, because there is a strange twist buried inside Margaret's story that I think about often. This was not a woman who was crushed by what happened to her at 13. She spent the rest of her long life turning herself into one of the most politically powerful women England had ever produced, quietly manoeuvring through decades of civil war, outliving 3 more husbands, funding scholars and founding colleges at Cambridge that still bear her name today, and eventually placing her own son on the throne of a country that had once treated her as little more than a valuable piece of property to be assigned. Margaret Beaufort's resilience became legendary. But resilience is not the same thing as consent, and it is worth asking ourselves honestly why we so often let one erase the other in the stories we choose to remember. Here is what almost nobody realizes about Margaret's case, though. It was not remotely unusual, at least not among people of her rank. Church law across medieval Europe set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, and that was treated as an entirely reasonable, entirely normal legal standard, not some dark exception whispered about in back rooms. Formal betrothals, the legal step before an actual wedding, could happen, even younger than that, sometimes to infants still in the cradle, as long as the marriage itself waited until the minimum age technically arrived. Margaret's own first engagement to John de la Pole was arranged when she was around 6 years old, but here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment because it cuts against what most of us have quietly assumed this whole time. It is tempting to picture every single person across medieval Europe marrying off as children the way Margaret did. Historians who have spent entire careers combing through old parish records and estate surveys have found something bordering on the opposite at least once you step outside the royal court. In the villages and farming communities that made up the overwhelming majority of the population, ordinary brides and grooms in places like England, France and the Low Countries were rarely marrying as children at all. Most were waiting until their mid-20s sometimes, later still because starting a household required land tool savings and often years spent working as a hired servant in someone else's home, first simply to afford the beginnings of a shared life. Child marriage, in other words, was overwhelmingly a habit of the powerful, not the ordinary. It was the price a family paid or collected for owning land holding a title or protecting a claim to a throne worth locking down early. The further down the social ladder you travelled, the older brides and grooms tended to get almost as though urgency itself were a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Now, before you settle into the comfortable idea that this was simply a brutal medieval custom that modern society eventually outgrew, let me ask you something. How recently do you think the last part of that sentence marriage before the age of 18 remained fully legal in every single American state? The answer is 2017. Nearly 300,000 minors were legally married in the United States between the year 2000 and the year 2018. Some were 16 or 17. A small number were as young as 10 years old. The overwhelming majority were girls married to adult men, an average of 4 years older than them, and researchers who studied the data found that in states without a specific minimum age written into law, the fallback legal standard defaulted to old common law. 12 years old for girls, 14 for boys. The exact same numbers written into church law almost 600 years before Margaret Beaufort was even born, quietly sitting inside American legal code well into the 21st century, mostly unnoticed until people finally started asking why. That is not a coincidence, by the way, and it is worth explaining exactly why those two numbers survived the crossing across an entire ocean and several hundred years intact. When English colonists settled in North America, They brought their legal system with them wholesale, including centuries of church-derived common law on marriage. American states, once they existed, largely never bothered rewriting that particular corner of the law from scratch. They simply inherited it the way you might inherit a piece of furniture nobody thought to replace, and left it sitting quietly in the family estate of American legal code for centuries, waiting for anyone to notice it was still there. And in case you are tempted to think England itself moved on from this a long time ago, consider this. England did not raise its own legal marriage age away from those same two medieval numbers, 12 and 14 until 1929, a full 500 years after Margaret Beaufort's own wedding, and even then only up to 16. It took until February of 2023, only a couple of years before I am telling you this story for England and Wales, to finally shut every remaining exception and set the age firmly at 18. 6 centuries at 12, nearly another century at 16. Full closure only within the last few years. How did this actually keep happening inside a modern country, with birth certificates, school enrollment records, and a legal voting age of 18? Mainly through 2 small words tucked into state law: parental consent. In many states, a minor could be legally married with nothing more than a parent's signature, and for the very youngest applicants, a judge's approval on top of it, often with no requirement to confirm that the minor's consent was freely given, no requirement to interview her privately away from the very parent pushing the marriage forward, and in a handful of states historically no firm minimum age specified in the law at all. One case researchers documented involved a girl abused for years by a much older man with her own mother's full knowledge and blessing, framed the whole time as God's plan for her life. When she was finally allowed to say the words out loud, she tried to refuse the marriage. She ran. As a minor with no independent legal standing, she was simply returned home by the very system meant to protect her, and married off exactly 1 week after her 17th birthday to her 23-year-old abuser. Researchers who study this call it bluntly a loophole for rape. Between the year 2000 and 2021, tens of thousands of those legal marriages in America involved an age or an age gap between spouses that would have counted as a sex crime if the 2 people involved had never signed a marriage certificate. The paperwork itself became the defense. Delaware and New Jersey did not shut this loophole completely until 2018, becoming the first 2 states in the entire country to ban marriage before 18 with no exceptions whatsoever. A handful of others have slowly followed since. But even now, in most American states, some version of this door remains at least partly open. Texas alone accounted for tens of thousands of these marriages over less than 2 decades, more than any other state in the country, with Florida, Nevada, and California not far behind. There is one more piece of this loophole that rarely makes it into the conversation, and it has nothing to do with state courthouses at all. Under federal immigration law, there has historically been no minimum age requirement for someone to petition for a foreign fiancé or spouse visa. Advocates who track this closely say the loophole runs in both directions. American girls used in effect to secure legal status for older men brought in from overseas, and American men legally importing brides who are still legally children in their country of origin. 2 very different mechanisms, one federal and one at the state level, both quietly landing on the exact same outcome. It helps, I think, to understand why lawmakers defended this system for so long on both sides of the ocean, because the most common argument was almost never framed around protecting a child's body at all. It was framed around protecting appearances. If a girl became pregnant outside of marriage, the reasoning went marrying her off immediately, no matter how young, no matter how unwilling, at least spared the coming child from being labelled illegitimate, and spared the family the shame of an unmarried daughter. That exact same logic word for word in some transcripts was argued on the floor of the British Parliament in 1929 and echoed again in American State House hearings less than 10 years ago. Protecting the child rarely seemed to be the priority in these debates. Protecting everyone else's comfort almost always was. I think what unsettles me most sitting here telling you both of these stories back to back is how differently we are trained to feel about them. Margaret Beaufort's marriage at 12 reads to most of us like distant, almost forgivable history. A brutal custom safely sealed behind 6 centuries of glass. A 17-year-old married off in an American courthouse 2 decades ago does not get that same protective distance, and honestly, I do not think it deserves one. Different century, same 12, same 14. Somehow the exact same quiet legal architecture still standing mostly unnoticed until somebody finally bothers to count. I am curious what you make of that. Does it surprise you that this was still fully legal everywhere in this country less than a decade ago? Or had you already heard something about it and just never really sat with what it actually meant? I would love to know down in the comments, because reactions to this particular fact tend to split people right down the middle. The United Nations classifies any marriage before the age of 18 as a human rights violation, full stop, with no carve-out for country culture or good intentions. That is a fairly recent, fairly modern moral consensus, and it makes the timeline we just walked through even harder to sit comfortably with. Here is the piece of this comparison that lingers with me longest, though. Margaret Beaufort, for all the horror of what happened to her body at 13, eventually had something most child brides never get anywhere near. An entire household of advisors of fortune and eventually an army loyal only to her. She turned a childhood she never chose into 5 decades of real tangible power. Compare that to a 17-year-old girl married off in an American courthouse in this century with no fortune, no private army, often no working phone she's allowed to use unsupervised. When women like her finally do escape, the exit tends to cost them everything. Their community, their family, sometimes every relationship they have ever known, starting completely from nothing alone, usually still legally a minor with no independent credit history, no work experience, and no one coming to place them on any kind of throne. Power protected Margaret. Nothing nearly as reliable protects most of the others. That gap between them raises an uncomfortable question. We have quietly stepped around this entire night, one that applies just as much to a 9-year-old in a royal chamber as it does to a fully grown, fully willing woman standing at the front of a church by her own choice, marrying a man she has loved for years, on a day she planned herself start to finish. Think back for a second to Marjorie from the very beginning of tonight's story, the one who fought a bishop for the right to marry the man she actually wanted. Say she had won every single battle in that story cleanly. Say her mother had blessed the match from day one, no secrecy, no cathedral trial, nothing forced about any part of it. Say she was fully grown, fully certain and utterly in love. Even then, even in the best, kindest, most freely chosen version of a medieval wedding, you could possibly imagine there is still one more room left to walk into before the story is truly over. And for an enormous stretch of human history across almost every culture we've touched on tonight, that particular room was very rarely private, no matter how freely the 2 people standing in it had chosen each other, and no matter how quiet the rest of the house pretended to be outside the door. There is a word for what I am describing, and once you learn it, you start noticing it tucked into old letters, court records and diaries from almost every corner of pre-modern Europe. Historians call it the bedding ceremony, and it was exactly what it sounds like. After the vows, after the feast, after the music finally quieted down, the newlyweds were formally walked, sometimes carried into their marriage bed, in front of an audience, Not a small awkward audience either. Family, friends, neighbours. Occasionally a priest there specifically to bless the bed itself before the couple even climbed into it. The guests would gather around, sometimes drawing the curtains only after everyone had gotten a good thorough look, sometimes staying seated right there in the room, while spiced wine, often called a benediction posset, was passed around and shared with the couple one final time before the door, if there even was a meaningful door, finally shut. In parts of England, guests would throw a stocking over their shoulders toward the bed, and whoever's toss landed closest to the groom's head was said to be the next among them to marry. Here is the part that tends to surprise people the most, though. This was not simply a rowdy party tradition, some medieval equivalent of tying cans to the back of a car. It served an actual legal function. In an era with no birth certificates, no marriage registries kept in triplicate, no easy way to prove a union had truly taken place, a witnessed consummation was in a very real sense the paperwork. If a marriage was ever challenged, later contested by a rival suitor, questioned by a jealous relative, or dragged in front of a church court, the way we saw happen earlier tonight, the people who had stood in that room became living proof the marriage was real. Their testimony could make or break an inheritance, legitimize or bastardize a child, decide who owned a piece of land for the next 3 generations. And this was never just an English quirk tucked away in one corner of one country. In parts of Scandinavia, families would borrow a specially decorated wedding bed from friends or neighbours specifically for the occasion, treating it almost like a piece of shared community property passed from household to household, as each new couple took their turn in it. Travel back further still to ancient Greece, and you find a version of the same instinct with a softer edge to it. Young unmarried women would gather just outside the newlywed's door and sing loudly through the night, drowning out any sound from inside a kindness dressed up as tradition. Even Scotland, where marriage law was famously loose, built an entire legal shortcut around this idea. Under old Scottish custom, if someone simply stumbled upon an unmarried couple sharing a bed, that witness alone could stand there and declare them legally married on the spot. No priest, no paperwork, no ceremony required at all. In a few corners of Catholic Europe, couples were even expected to do the opposite of rushing toward that bed. Following a custom drawn from an old biblical story, some newlyweds were encouraged to hold off on consummating the marriage for the first 1, 2, or 3 nights, entirely spending that time in prayer instead, as a small act of devotion, before finally allowing the marriage to proceed. Even restraint, it turns out, could become a performance for an audience just a quieter one. Let me give you a name to attach to this, because I think it lands harder with an actual person standing at the centre of it, rather than a vague description of medieval couples in general. In the summer of 1525, a former Catholic monk named Martin Luther, the man whose ideas had already split the Church of Western Europe in two, decided to marry a former nun named Katharina von Bora. If that sounds like a fairly ordinary personal decision, do you understand that at the time it was closer to setting off a bomb? Monks and nuns were considered under church law much like spiritual brother and sister. To critics of the Reformation, a monk marrying a nun did not come across as romance. It came across as something closer to scandal dressed up in wedding clothes. One of Luther's own colleagues at the university predicted that if he actually went through with it, the whole world and the devil along with it would laugh him into ruin. Luther did it anyway, and he did it fast, gathering a small circle of dear friends into his own house on a June evening with almost no advance warning. He later joked in his own typically blunt way that marrying Katharina would please his father, annoy the Pope enormously, and leave the angels laughing while the devils wept. The reaction across Europe proved him right almost immediately. The great scholar Erasmus dismissed the whole affair as a kind of dark comedy. England's own King Henry VIII, a man who would go on to marry 6 times and execute 2 of his wives, apparently found the audacity to call Luther's marriage a crime, which even by the standards of the 16th century is a fairly rich complaint coming from that particular source. Among the small circle Luther did invite was a fellow reformer named Justus Jonas, who, according to his own letter written the very next morning, stood in that bedroom and watched Luther and Katharina together on the marriage bed, as an official witness to the deed. Jonas wrote to a mutual friend that he'd been overcome with emotion at the sight his eyes welling up without fully understanding why. That letter still survives today. I want you to sit with the strangeness of that for a second, because I think it is easy to rush past. Martin Luther, one of the most consequential and controversial men of his entire century, invited a friend to formally witness his wedding night specifically, so that nobody could later claim the marriage had never really happened, that it was some kind of illicit arrangement between a runaway monk and a runaway nun rather than a legitimate union blessed by God. The most private moment 2 people can share became quite deliberately a piece of public relations for the entire Protestant Reformation. Luther needed a witness the same way you or I might keep a receipt. And can we talk for just a moment about poor Justus Jonas? The man agreed to stand in a room and watch his dear friend consummate a marriage purely as a professional favour, and then went home and wrote about how emotionally overwhelming the whole experience had been. I don't know exactly what expression I would have had on my own face in that scenario, but I imagine it would not have been an easy one to explain to anyone who asked how my morning was going. Now, if a private citizen's wedding night could turn into a matter of theological politics, you can probably guess what happened once we start talking about actual monarchs. And this is where the story gets, in my honest opinion, almost unbelievably strange. In May of 1770, a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess named Maria Antonia arrived in France to marry the 15-year-old heir to the French throne, a boy who would eventually become King Louis XVI. Their wedding was designed from the very beginning to seal a political alliance between 2 countries that had spent generations as enemies, and everyone involved understood exactly what was expected of the young couple almost immediately. An heir, ideally several of them as quickly as biology would allow. Custom at the Palace of Versailles required the entire court to escort the newlyweds directly to their bedroom on their wedding night, where the 2 teenagers were quite literally put on display in front of an audience of courtiers before anyone was finally permitted to leave them alone. It did not go well, and here is where the story takes a truly bizarre turn. It kept not going well for 7 consecutive years. It helps to understand that this was not even unusual behaviour for Versailles specifically, only an especially high-stakes version of it. French royalty at the time lived under an entire daily ritual of public waking and public retiring, to bed courtiers filing into the royal bedchamber each morning to watch the king rise, and again each evening to watch him prepare for sleep treated as an honour worth competing for rather than an intrusion worth resenting. Privacy for people at that level of society was not simply rare, it was in a very real sense considered beneath their rank. A king who slept alone unwatched was in some strange way a king who mattered slightly less. Nobody to this day can say with total certainty why. Some historians point to a minor physical condition affecting Louis that likely made the whole process more painful and difficult than it should have been, something that may have quietly resolved itself or been resolved later in the marriage. Others point to simple nerves immaturity, or a young man who by nearly every account was more sincerely passionate about hunting, locksmithing and geography than he ever was about his own bride. Whatever the true cause, the fact of it became public knowledge almost immediately, and once it did, all of Europe seemed to develop a rather intense curiosity about it. Crude pamphlets began circulating through the streets of Paris, mocking the young king's manhood, in exactly the kind of language you would expect from anonymous political propaganda, with absolutely no restraint. Some described in mocking, exaggerated detail exactly what allegedly did or did not happen behind that bedroom door, treating the private failures of a 19-year-old husband as public entertainment for anyone willing to pay a few coins for the latest sheet of gossip. The insinuation running underneath every single one of them was sharp and deliberate. If a man could not perform his most basic duty in the bedroom, how could anyone trust him to competently run an entire country? Marie Antoinette's own mother, watching anxiously from Austria, wrote her letter after letter, urging her to be warmer, more affectionate, more inviting toward her husband, treating her own daughter's marriage bed as a matter of active foreign policy between two empires. Marie Antoinette, for her part, later confessed she lived those years in a state of genuine dread, terrified that her failure to produce an heir would eventually get her sent home to Austria in disgrace, discarded like a broken treaty. Imagine carrying that particular fear at 14, then 15, then 16 years old, while an entire kingdom quietly, and not always so quietly, gossiped about your bedroom. She could not walk through a single room at Versailles without wondering how many of the eyes on her were doing the math on exactly how many months had passed since her wedding. When the marriage was finally fully consummated in 1777, it took another 2 years after that before Marie Antoinette gave birth to their first child. By then, those years of pamphlets and speculation had already done lasting damage to how the French public viewed her feeding directly into the wave of vicious, often sexually explicit propaganda that would follow her for the rest of her life, and which historians now generally agree helped pave a real road toward the guillotine that eventually ended it. By the time Marie Antoinette was living through her own very public ordeal, the older, more literal version of the bedding ceremony, the one Justus Jonas had participated in for Luther 2 centuries earlier, was already fading out of fashion across most of Western Europe. Full physical witnessing had mostly softened by the late 1600s into something more symbolic. Parents briefly covering a newlywed couple with a blanket, and then almost immediately drawing it back again, guests toasting from a respectful distance, rather than crowding around the bed itself. The instinct behind it, though, the belief that a marriage was never entirely a private matter between two people, took a great deal longer to fully disappear, if it ever really has at all. So here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I would love to hear where you land on it in the comments. We tend to assume that royalty, with all its wealth and its palaces and its endless staff, must have enjoyed more privacy than ordinary people, not less. Based on everything we have just walked through, do you think that is actually true? Or does it seem like the higher you climbed on the social ladder throughout most of history, the less of your own life, right down to your own bedroom, actually still belonged to you? Line these 3 pictures up next to each other for a second, because I think the shape underneath them only becomes obvious once you do. An ordinary village couple watched by neighbours passing spiced wine around a borrowed bed so that no one could later dispute whose land their children would inherit. A former monk deliberately inviting a witness into his own wedding night to protect an entire religious movement from accusations of scandal. And a 14-year-old future queen watched first by a room full of courtiers, then by an entire country reading pamphlets about her for 7 straight years, because the fate of a royal alliance quite literally hinged on what happened or did not happen behind that bedroom door. 3 completely different centuries, 3 completely different social classes, and in every single case, the exact same underlying belief that a marriage bed belonged at least a little to everyone standing around it, not only to the 2 people lying in it. Here is what I keep coming back to, though turning it over long after I first learned about all 3 of them. Once those witnesses had done their job once, a marriage bed had been seen, blessed gossiped about or written up in a letter, the marriage itself was considered locked into place. Legally sealed, publicly confirmed, essentially impossible to undo, no matter how the two people inside that room actually felt about each other 5, 10, or 20 years later. The community that had crowded in for the beginning rarely showed the same interest in showing up for the end, which raises an obvious, considerably darker question we've not touched at all tonight. What was a person actually supposed to do once bound this thoroughly, this publicly, to a marriage they could no longer stand to remain inside of divorce? In the modern sense we understand it today simply did not exist for most of the people we've been discussing. Annulment required proving the marriage had never been valid in the first place, which, as we just spent the last several minutes establishing, was exactly the thing an entire room full of witnesses had gathered specifically to make impossible to argue. For most of history across most of Europe, the honest answer to what happened next is almost nothing at all. People simply stayed miserable or not bound by exactly the kind of witnessed, blessed, publicly documented beginning we just spent this entire section walking through. But not everywhere and not always. In one particular stretch of English history, ordinary people facing an unbearable marriage found an entirely different, deeply strange solution. One that turned an unwanted spouse into something you could walk down to the local market and simply sell in full view of the very same kind of crowd that had once gathered to witness the wedding in the first place. Picture the scene for a moment, because it is far stranger and far more public than most people ever imagine when they first hear about it. A husband leads his wife through the middle of a crowded market past stalls of vegetables, fresh bread and butchered meat, a rope or a length of ribbon tied loosely around her neck, wrist or waist. A crowd gathers curious, some of them already familiar with how this works, elbowing their way closer for a better view. Someone, sometimes the husband himself, sometimes a hired auctioneer standing on an overturned crate, begins calling out her qualities to the onlookers, much the way you would describe the temperament of a horse or the health of a cow. Bids come in. A price is agreed upon. Money changes hands, usually just a few coins, sometimes barely enough to buy a round of drinks afterward. And just like that, according to everyone standing in that marketplace, a marriage that had grown unbearable was considered legally, publicly, permanently over. This was not some obscure legend or a single strange incident blown out of proportion over the centuries. This was wife-selling, and it was practiced with real regularity in England between the late 1600s and well into the 1800s, occasionally stretching even further than that. Let me set one specific scene for you because I think it captures the whole strange contradiction of this custom better than any statistic could. In the summer of 1797, a publican from Lisson Green walked his wife to Smithfield Market in London, tied her to the railings across from a coffee house, and sold her to a florist from Paddington for the price of a single guinea, along with 20 additional pounds paid out in coins, so worn and battered they were barely worth their face value. The scene was popular enough that an artist named George Cruikshank turned it into a widely circulated satirical print, the kind of image ordinary Londoners would have recognised and laughed at almost on sight. Here is what I find almost impossible to get past, though, and I would love to know if it strikes you the same way. Smithfield Market was not some symbolic backdrop chosen for effect. It was London's actual livestock market, the exact same square of ground where farmers sold cattle, sheep and pigs to butchers every single week. The people running that particular wife sale did not choose a random public square to make a point. They walked into the one place in the entire city built and understood by absolutely everyone for buying and selling animals and used it exactly as intended. The custom was normal enough even among educated people that the philosopher John Locke once joked about it in a private letter to a friend in France, comparing the going rate for a wife to the price of meat sold by weight, and remarking that a beautiful, healthy young woman would naturally fetch a higher price than one who had already been, in his own crude phrasing, well used. It is a deeply uncomfortable joke to hear today, but the fact that a serious philosopher felt comfortable making it casually in personal correspondence tells you everything about how unremarkable this practice has become in ordinary conversation among people who considered themselves perfectly civilized. So why on earth would ordinary, otherwise unremarkable people do this? The answer has almost nothing to do with cruelty for its own sake, and almost everything to do with money, paperwork, and a legal system that had made divorce for most people a complete practical impossibility. If your marriage in England fell apart during this period, actual legal divorce required something called a private act of parliament, an individual law passed specifically for your case, requiring lawyers, courts, and eventually a vote in the House of Lords itself. The whole process could easily cost several £1,000s, roughly equivalent to what an unskilled labourer of the time might expect to earn across an entire working lifetime, completely out of reach for anyone who was not aristocratic or extraordinarily wealthy, and even among the small number of people who could technically afford to try the process, overwhelmingly favoured husbands over wives. Between 1700 and 1857, out of 338 people who attempted this kind of parliamentary divorce, only 8 were women, and only 4 of those 8 actually succeeded. There was a second quieter piece of legal machinery tangled up in all of this one that rarely gets mentioned, but explains why so many of these sales unfolded exactly the way they did. Under the law at the time, a husband could sue any man who had a relationship with his wife for something called criminal conversation, essentially treating another man's affection for her as a form of property damage owed directly to him. A formal sale witnessed publicly and agreed to openly made that particular lawsuit effectively impossible to bring afterward, which is one of the main reasons the buyer in so many recorded cases turns out to already be the wife's existing lover, quietly protected from a lawsuit by the very same public spectacle that looked on its surface so degrading. There was a practical financial motive sitting underneath the ritual as well, and it explains why even husbands with no lawsuit to worry about still found the custom appealing. Once a wife was formally sold any debts, she ran up afterward, any bills, any obligations became the new buyer's legal responsibility rather than her original husband's. For a struggling tradesman married to a woman he could no longer support, or simply no longer wish to support, a public sale functioned almost like signing over a lease. Everything that came with her, financially speaking, changed hands right along with her. For everyone else, for the overwhelming majority of ordinary working people, trapped in a marriage that had become miserable, dangerous, or simply unbearable, wife selling filled a gap the law had left wide open. It became, in the words used by historians who have studied it closely, an informal but broadly recognized alternative to a legal system that had priced ordinary people out of ever escaping their own marriage. Now here is where I think the story becomes far more interesting than the simple version people usually hear, because it would be easy to walk away from what I just described, assuming every wife involved in this custom was purely a victim dragged unwillingly through the streets. Some absolutely were. But the historical record tells a far messier, more complicated story than that. Take the case of a market sale recorded in Wenlock in 1830, where a wife described in local accounts only as Mattie showed up fully determined to see her own sale through to completion. According to the man who witnessed it, her husband actually got cold feet at the very last moment and tried to back out of the arrangement. Mattie was having absolutely none of it. She reportedly told him plainly in front of the gathered crowd that she intended to be sold whether he liked it or not, because she wanted a change in her life, and this was the only tool available to get one. Or consider a sale recorded in Manchester in 1824, where a wife was auctioned off and sold for 5 shillings, only for her to take one look at the man who had just purchased her and flatly refuse to go through with it. The auction remarkably simply continued. She was put back up for sale a second time, and eventually accepted an offer of 3 shillings and a quart of ale from a buyer she found more agreeable. Whatever legal fiction the surrounding community had built around this custom in practice, at least in some of these documented cases, the woman standing at the centre of it still held real, exercised veto power over her own fate. Then there is the sale recorded in April of 1832 involving a man named Joseph Thompson, which shows just how theatrical this whole ritual could become. According to witnesses, Thompson placed his wife in a large chair with a halter around her neck, waited for the town crier to announce the sale at noon to a curious growing crowd, and then delivered what amounted to a full comic performance, listing off her faults at length, before pivoting almost like a market trader, closing a deal to praise her better qualities in order to secure a decent final price. It reads less like a private tragedy and more like a piece of street theatre the entire town had turned out to watch, complete with its own showman playing to the crowd. I do not say any of this to suggest wife-selling was some kind of hidden feminist triumph dressed up in ugly clothing. It plainly was not, and for a great many women swept into it, this was humiliating, coercive, and truly dangerous. But history rarely hands us anything as clean as a single, uncomplicated moral lesson, and I think it does the real women involved a disservice to flatten every single one of their stories down into pure victimhood, when the record itself shows something far more complicated sitting underneath it. A woman with almost no legal standing, almost no property rights, and almost no realistic path to a courtroom divorce still occasionally managed to bend one of the ugliest customs of her era into the one tool available for getting exactly what she wanted. That is not a happy ending. It is something closer to survival dressed up as spectacle for a crowd that had gathered expecting only the spectacle. Public reaction to all of this shifted considerably over time, and that shift itself tells its own story. Earlier reports from the 1750s describe crowds that mostly treated these sales as unremarkable, even mildly entertaining local business, with newspapers recording perhaps 2 such cases per decade. By the 1820s and 1830s, the practice had reached what researchers consider its peak, with newspaper reports climbing into the dozens per decade, somewhere around 50 documented sales across those 10 years alone. Altogether, historians who have combed through parish records, newspapers, and court files estimate somewhere between 300 and 400 documented wife sales across the entire 18th and 19th centuries, a number roughly comparable to the total count of parliamentary divorces granted across that exact same stretch of time. 2 entirely different paths out of an unbearable marriage, running side by side for well over a century, used by roughly the same number of people, one costing a small fortune and requiring an act of the highest legislature in the land, the other costing a shilling and requiring nothing more than a rope and a willing crowd. The custom left enough of an impression on English culture that it eventually found its way into serious literature. The novelist Thomas Hardy opened one of his most famous books with a wife sale, a fictional scene many readers in his own time recognized as drawn directly from a real lingering folk memory rather than pure invention. By the time that novel was published in the 1880s, the practice was already fading toward extinction, which may be exactly why Hardy felt safe enough to finally put it into print. Alongside that 1820s and 30s peak came real organised resistance as well. In Dublin in 1756, a group of women physically interrupted a sale in progress and rescued the wife on the spot, and the husband responsible was publicly humiliated, placed overnight in the stocks as informal punishment. When a labourer attempted to sell his wife at Smithfield in 1806, the crowd turned angry enough at him that police officers reportedly had to step in not to stop the sale itself, but to physically protect the husband from the mob's growing fury. One magistrate of the era, when later asked why he had never intervened to stop a wife sale happening in his own jurisdiction, admitted plainly that he did not actually believe the law gave him any real authority to do so. Nobody had ever formally legalized wife selling, but almost nobody in power seemed entirely certain they had the authority to stop it either, which left it sitting for well over a century in a strange, unresolved legal grey zone. Not endorsed, not banned, simply tolerated by a system that had failed to offer people any better option. There is something almost comically English about the whole arrangement, honestly. An entire nation famous for its love of rules and procedure somehow spent well over 100 years pretending not to notice a very public, very well-attended loophole sitting right in the middle of its own biggest cattle market. You would expect a custom this openly strange to fade away quickly once real legal reform finally arrived, and to some degree it did. In 1857, England finally passed a law creating an actual divorce court, removing the requirement of an individual Act of Parliament for good. Wife selling declined sharply after that. It did not disappear completely, though, and this next detail still surprises almost everyone I mention it to. As late as 1913, a case was recorded in Leeds involving a woman reportedly sold to one of her husband's own colleagues for £1. 1913, a year before the outbreak of the First World War. Well within living memory of people who would go on to see automobiles, telephones and eventually television flicker to life in their own front rooms. I want you to notice something, if you will, about where this entire story leaves us tonight. We began this whole journey talking about marriage as a transaction, a transfer of land and money disguised in a wedding dress, a father formally handing his daughter's ownership over to a husband in front of witnesses. It turns out that when a marriage finally broke down completely, when two people simply could not bear to remain bound to each other any longer, the exit available to ordinary people followed exactly the same underlying logic as the entrance had. A wife was walked into a public square, priced and sold, using precisely the same economic reasoning, and in Smithfield's case precisely the same square footage of ground that had once justified bringing her into the marriage in the first place. The system never really saw her as anything other than a piece of property changing hands. It simply changed which hands. I would love to know what you make of that particular symmetry down in the comments. Does it strike you as a strange, isolated custom that stands apart from everything else we have covered tonight, or does it feel the way it does to me, like the same underlying belief about marriage simply showing its face one final time on the way out the door? And here is the harder question underneath that one. If the legal system of an entire country had made the honest, legitimate exit so expensive that ordinary people had to invent their own version out of a rope and a marketplace whose failure was that really, the individual families who used this strange workaround, or the lawmakers who left them with nothing better, because if a village market could turn an ordinary, unremarkable marriage into a public transaction from beginning to end, you can probably already guess what happened once the marriage in question belonged not to a farmer or a publican, but to an entire royal family, with an entire nation's fortunes riding on exactly who ended up standing at the altar in the first place. Let me take you to a temple wall in southern Egypt carved more than 3,000 years ago, because it holds one of the clearest examples I have ever come across of exactly what I mean. Long before crowns, coronets, or Latin mottos ever entered the picture, For roughly 2 decades, the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II fought an exhausting, largely unwinnable war against the Hittite Empire for control of trade routes running through modern-day Syria. The most famous clash between the two armies, the Battle of Kadesh, was so bloody and so inconclusive that both sides went home afterward, claiming victory, commissioning monuments celebrating a triumph neither of them had actually achieved. Neither empire could finish the other off. Both sides eventually simply ran out of will to keep trying. So in the 21st year of his reign, Ramesses agreed to something remarkable for the era. An actual peace treaty inscribed onto a silver tablet, outlining borders promising neither side would invade the other, and committing both empires to return any refugees who fled from one side to the other. Historians consider it the oldest surviving peace treaty in the entire world. A copy of it, translated, hangs today on the wall of the United Nations headquarters in New York, presented as an early symbol of diplomacy actually working. Here is the detail that rarely makes it into that particular story, though. Roughly 13 years after the treaty was signed, the Hittite king sent his own eldest daughter to Egypt to become one of Ramesses's wives, sealing the peace with an actual bloodline connection between the two former enemies. The wedding, by every surviving account, was treated as one of the largest, most extravagant events of Ramesses's entire reign, and Egyptian inscriptions even credit Ramesses's own prayers with securing favourable weather for the bride's long winter journey across the mountains. And in a detail I find almost impossible not to smile at the whole arrangement nearly collapsed at the last possible moment over a dispute about the size of her dowry. The Hittite queen herself, a formidable woman named Puduhepa, wrote directly to Ramesses accusing him in essence of being greedy, asking him plainly whether he had no possessions of his own that he needed to grow richer at her family's expense. Two former mortal enemies, freshly at peace after 20 years of open war, nearly falling back into an argument over money one more time before the wedding could even take place. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it tells you something important about what marriages like this one were actually built to do. Nobody involved in that arrangement expected Ramesses and his new Hittite bride to fall in love in any way we would recognize today. That was never remotely the point. The marriage existed to do something a treaty written on silver could not fully accomplish on its own, no matter how impressive. It turned two governments who had spent decades trying to kill each other's soldiers into two governments who now shared grandchildren. Now, if that strikes you as an unusually calculated way to use a wedding, wait until you hear how one single European dynasty turned the entire strategy into an actual deliberate generations-long policy with its own catchphrase attached. The House of Habsburg ruled from Austria, and by the late 1400s they had developed almost a formula for building an empire without ever having to fight one battle for it, a formula so consistently successful that other European royal families quietly resented them for it. Their approach eventually earned its own Latin motto, one that got repeated across European courts for centuries afterward, sometimes admiringly, sometimes through gritted teeth. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. It was not an empty boast. In 1477, the Habsburg heir Maximilian married Mary, the sole heiress of the immensely wealthy Duchy of Burgundy, instantly folding a huge swath of what is now the Netherlands and Belgium into Habsburg territory without a single soldier crossing a border. 19 years later, Maximilian arranged an even more ambitious match, marrying his own son off to the heiress of the Spanish crown. When the dust settled a generation later, their grandson, a boy named Charles, inherited Austria, the Netherlands, Spain, and the entire staggeringly wealthy Spanish Empire stretching across the Americas, all of it acquired not through conquest, but through two carefully arranged weddings, a string of convenient early deaths among rival heirs, and a healthy dose of good luck in who happened to survive long enough to inherit what. Try to sit with the scale of that for a moment. An empire large enough that within a single generation people truly started saying the sun never set on it, built almost entirely out of marriage contracts rather than battlefields. Somewhere out there, a long line of exhausted medieval generals were presumably furious to learn that the single most effective military strategy of their entire era involved no fighting whatsoever. But here is the part of the Habsburg story that turns this whole triumphant tale into something considerably darker, and I think it is one of the great quietly devastating ironies in all of European history. Once the family had successfully collected an empire this enormous through marriage, their next problem became keeping it. And the solution they landed on was to keep marrying generation after generation, but now increasingly within their own family. Uncles marrying nieces, first cousins marrying first cousins, all in an effort to prevent any of that hard-won territory from ever slipping away through an outside marriage the way they themselves had once acquired it. Researchers who later reconstructed the Habsburg family tree spanning more than 3,000 individuals across 16 generations were able to calculate exactly how genetically related the family had become to itself by the end. The dynasty's founder had what geneticists call an inbreeding coefficient of roughly 2.5%, already slightly elevated but unremarkable for the era. By the time you reach the line's final Spanish king, a deeply unwell man named Charles II, that number had climbed to over 25%, statistically equivalent to what you would expect from the child of siblings. Charles suffered from severe physical and developmental disabilities his entire life, could not produce an heir with either of his two wives, and died in 1700, extinguishing the Spanish line of the family completely and dragging most of Europe into a bloody war over who would inherit what he left behind. If you have ever looked at a portrait of a Habsburg monarch and noticed an unusually pronounced jutting jawline, you are not imagining things, and you are not looking at an unflattering painter's exaggeration either. That particular feature shows up so consistently across generations of Habsburg portraits that historians and geneticists still refer to it today quite bluntly as the Habsburg jaw, a visible signature of exactly how often this family had been marrying itself. The very tool the Habsburgs had used to build an empire without ever fighting a war ended up a few generations later triggering one of the largest wars in Europe anyway. Marriage, it turns out, is a strategy with an expiration date if you're not careful about exactly who you keep marrying. But if you want to see the absolute clearest example of a marriage rewriting the fate of an entire civilization, not just moving borders around on a map, we need to travel to the city of Kiev in the year 988. At the time, the ruler of the Kievan Rus, a warlord named Vladimir, was by every account that survives thoroughly unapologetically pagan. Chronicles from the period claim he kept somewhere between 5 and 7 wives simultaneously, along with several hundred concubines spread across multiple residences. Meanwhile, a few hundred miles south, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II found himself facing a dangerous internal rebellion, led by one of his own generals, an uprising serious enough that it truly threatened to topple him from his own throne, and he needed military help, far more help than his own weakened forces could realistically provide. Vladimir offered exactly that help, 6,000 elite Varangian soldiers, in exchange for one very specific, very unusual price. He wanted to marry the emperor's own sister, a woman named Anna, who carried a title Byzantine chroniclers used only for children actually born inside the imperial palace itself. Porphyrogenitor, meaning quite literally born in the purple. Byzantine princesses with that particular title were considered so prestigious that earlier proposals from powerful foreign kings, men ruling entire nations in Western Europe, had already been turned down as beneath her standing, Basil desperate enough to accept an offer he would have rejected under any less urgent circumstances agreed, but attached one enormous condition of his own. Vladimir would have to abandon his old gods entirely and convert to Christianity before the marriage could happen at all. Vladimir agreed. He gave up every one of his other wives and concubines, converted and married Anna in the year 988. And because an entire nation's ruler had just adopted a new religion in order to marry a Byzantine princess, that religion spread with him, cascading down through his entire kingdom, in what historians now consider one of the single most consequential religious conversions in world history. The moment that set the Eastern Slavic world the roots of what would eventually become Russia and Ukraine, permanently onto a path shaped by Byzantine Christianity, its alphabet, its art and its politics, all of it traceable back to one marriage negotiated as the price of a few thousand soldiers. The man who had by his own chronicler's account kept hundreds of concubines across multiple households, before that wedding is remembered today by the Orthodox Church as Saint Vladimir, credited with single-handedly bringing Christianity to an entire civilization. It is one of history's stranger character arcs, and Anna, whether she ever wanted the assignment or not, was standing at the exact hinge point of it. Here is the detail I think about most, though, whenever I revisit Anna's story, and I would love to hear how it lands with you. According to the chronicles that survive, Anna did not want this marriage even slightly. She's described weeping openly on her journey away from Constantinople, dreading the unfamiliar distant land where she would spend the rest of her life, among people her own culture still considered barbarians. She went anyway because a Byzantine princess born in the purple chamber of an emperor's palace was never under any real circumstance going to be permitted to say no to a marriage her own brother's throne depended on. And yet once she actually arrived in Kiev, Anna did not simply fade into the background of her own life story. And this is the part I find worth holding on to whenever this kind of history threatens to feel entirely bleak. By most surviving accounts, she became an active, engaged partner in reshaping her new husband's kingdom, advising him on religious matters, helping establish some of the very first churches built on Kievan soil, and lending her own imperial prestige to a newly Christian court that badly needed exactly that kind of legitimacy. Some historians even believe she and Vladimir went on to have children of their own together, though the record here grows frustratingly thin the way it so often does for women whose entire recorded existence depends on how much their male relatives happen to write down. A marriage that began as a military transaction negotiated by two men who never once consulted her, still somehow left room for the woman at its centre to become one of the most influential figures in her adopted country's entire history. That does not undo the unfairness of how she got there. But it does complicate the idea that women swept into these enormous political marriages were nothing more than passive cargo delivered and then forgotten. So here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a second. We tend to talk about marriage historically as either a romantic story or a tragic one, something that happened to two individual people. But in every single example we've just walked through together tonight, the actual bride or groom standing at the centre of the ceremony was almost the least important detail in the entire arrangement. What mattered was the treaty, the territory, the soldiers, the silver, the centuries of peace or conquest, riding on top of two people who in more than one of these cases had never even met before their own wedding day. I would love to know honestly which of these three stories unsettles you the most and why. The ancient one sealed by an actual surviving treaty, the deliberate multi-generational strategy that eventually consumed its own architects, or the single wedding that quietly redirected the religious future of an entire civilization. Let me know down in the comments. I keep coming back to one particular irony sitting underneath all three of these stories, and I think it is worth naming directly. We remember Rameses for his monuments, Charles V for his empire, and the Christianization of Rus for reshaping the map of an entire civilization for 1,000 years. We very rarely stop to ask what any of that must have actually felt like from inside the wedding itself for the specific individual, presumably terrified young woman standing at the center of each one of those history-altering ceremonies, expected to smile for a crowd, while her entire future was decided by men she had, in some cases, never even met the week before. Here is what strikes me most, laying all three of these side by side. Ordinary people, the kind we spent the earlier part of tonight talking about, were forced into these arrangements because a father needed land, or a family needed status, or a community needed to know exactly whose child belonged to whom. Kings and emperors did the exact same thing for the exact same underlying reasons, just multiplied outward until the stakes were measured in continents instead of acres. The scale changed completely. The basic transaction underneath it never did. A farmer negotiating his daughter's dowry over a kitchen table, and an emperor negotiating his sister's marriage over a rebellion he might not survive, were underneath all the ceremony and the crowns doing exactly the same math. And once you start looking closely at those ceremonies themselves, at the actual rings, the veils, the specific clothing everyone insisted on for these enormous political weddings, you start to notice something else entirely. None of it was ever chosen at random. Every ribbon, every colour, every piece of jewellery placed on a bride's hand carried meaning that the people watching that day would have understood instantly, and that almost none of us would recognise now. And once you learn what a wedding ring or a bridal veil actually stood for centuries ago, I promise you will never look at either one quite the same way again. Start with the ring, because it is the one piece of this entire story that almost every single person listening to me right now is either wearing, has worn, or plans to wear one day, and I would be willing to bet good money that almost none of you actually know where the habit came from. It is such a small, familiar object that most of us never stop to ask a single question about it. The earliest known finger rings used specifically to mark a couple's union come from ancient Egypt, fashioned out of nothing more expensive than braided reeds and river rushes, pulled from along the banks of the Nile. The shape itself was the entire point. A circle has no beginning and no visible end, and Egyptian couples adopted that unbroken loop as a fitting symbol for something they intended to last a lifetime. It is a truly lovely idea, and if the story stopped right there, I would have nothing else to add. But it does not stop there, because the Romans got hold of the custom next, and true to form, they turned something poetic into something considerably more transactional. Roman betrothal rings were frequently made of plain iron rather than gold, and this was not a matter of taste. Iron was chosen specifically because it was strong, and durable meant to physically outlast the relationship it represented, functioning less like a piece of jewellery and more like a signed contract you could wear on your hand. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how little romance the Romans apparently felt was necessary for a proposal. Somewhere between the reed rings of the Nile and the courthouses of Rome, somebody looked at a beautiful circular symbol of eternal devotion and thought, yes, but what if we made it out of the same material we use for horseshoes and prison bars? The writer Pliny the Elder, cataloguing Roman customs in the 1st century, described exactly how these rings were used and worn, treating them as a matter of law and social rank rather than romantic sentiment. For a Roman bride specifically, that ring on her finger was widely understood as a visible mark of whose household she now legally belonged to the same underlying idea we already spent an entire earlier stretch of tonight unpacking, just condensed down onto a single finger instead of an entire ceremony. Here is a detail I have always found charming, even though it turns out to be scientifically nonsense. Both the Egyptians and the Romans believed a particular vein ran directly from the fourth finger of the left hand straight to the heart, a so-called vein of love. That belief is exactly why we still slide rings onto that specific finger today, thousands of years later, in cultures that have long since forgotten the reasoning behind it. Modern anatomy tells us rather bluntly that no such vein exists. Every finger on your hand is connected to your heart by roughly the same unremarkable plumbing. But the story was simply too beautiful to abandon once people had already fallen in love with it, so the custom stuck around anyway. Thousands of years after the biology behind it was proven completely wrong, wealthier Roman brides sometimes received 2 separate rings rather than just one, and the split itself tells you something about how practical, even unromantic, the whole custom really was underneath the poetry. A gold ring was meant to be worn out in public, a visible display of status for anyone watching. A plain iron ring, meanwhile, stayed on her hand around the house, where showing off wealth mattered considerably less than simply marking day to day whose wife she was. Many Roman rings were also engraved with 2 clasped right hands, a motif called the dextrarum junctio, representing the sacred bond of fidelity between husband and wife. It is a striking enough image that jewelers were still quietly recycling the same design more than 1,000 years later in medieval Europe, under a slightly different name. You may remember from earlier tonight the Habsburg heir Maximilian and his marriage to Mary of Burgundy, the union that folded an entire wealthy duchy into his family's holdings without a single battle fought. That same wedding in 1477 is also credited by historians as the first recorded instance of a diamond engagement ring. Anywhere in the historical record, small flat diamonds arranged to spell out the letter M for his bride's name. So the very same marriage that quietly rewrote the map of Europe also happened to accidentally invent one of the most enduring, most expensive traditions in the history of modern romance. I doubt either of them had any idea standing there in 1477 that they were setting a precedent that would eventually be worth billions of dollars a year in the jewelry industry alone. I'm curious, honestly, whether that particular detail changes anything for you. If you are wearing a ring right now, or you have one waiting somewhere for a future proposal, does it feel any different knowing it descends from an iron Roman property marker, rather than a spontaneous outpouring of romantic feeling? For what it is worth, even the diamond itself, the part of the ring most of us now consider absolutely essential, only became the expected standard within the last 100 years, largely thanks to a single remarkably effective advertising campaign, launched in the middle of the 20th century, built around 4 words that convinced an entire generation: a diamond was the only acceptable proof of lasting love. Even our most modern wedding traditions, it turns out, are considerably younger and considerably more manufactured than they like to appear. I would love to hear your gut reaction to all of this in the comments before we move any further into tonight's story. Now let's talk about the veil, because if the ring's history surprised you, this one might surprise you even more. Roman brides wore a veil called the flammeum, a large cloth dyed a deep yellow or orange meant to resemble the colour of an open flame. Pliny the Elder himself compared its exact shade to the colour of an egg yolk, and other Roman writers connected it to luteum, a bright yellow dye pulled from a common local plant. The purpose behind it had nothing whatsoever to do with modesty or romance. Romans sincerely believed a bride was uniquely vulnerable to evil spirits on her wedding day, jealous forces that might curse the marriage or try to harm her before it could even properly begin. Wrapping her head and face in a fire-coloured cloth was thought to disguise her spiritual camouflage, disguising her from anything malicious enough to come looking. If evil spirits could not identify which woman in the crowd was actually the bride, the thinking went they could not target her specifically. Some Roman writers went even further, connecting the flame colour to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, as though every bride briefly carried a piece of sacred fire into her new household along with her. A completely different tradition from a completely different culture explains the veil in an entirely different way, and I think the contrast between the two is worth sitting with. In Jewish wedding custom, there is a ceremony called the betrothal performed just before the marriage itself, in which the groom approaches his bride, lifts her veil to look directly at her face, and then lowers it again before the ceremony begins. This tradition traces back to a story in the book of Genesis, where a man named Jacob, expecting to marry a woman named Rachel, after working 7 years to earn the right, was deceived into marrying her older sister Leah instead, because Leah's face was hidden beneath a veil throughout the entire ceremony, and he never thought to check until it was already far too late. The betrothal exists quite literally to make sure that particular mistake never happens again. Before the vows are spoken, the groom looks and confirms with his own eyes exactly who he is marrying, a small ritual built entirely around the memory of one very old, very costly case of mistaken identity. I find something almost touching about the fact that two civilizations separated by geography and centuries landed on the exact same piece of fabric for two completely different reasons. One culture using it to hide the bride from something dangerous outside the marriage, the other using it, at least symbolically, to make absolutely certain the right two people were actually marrying each other in the first place. There is also a far more practical theory some historians point to worth mentioning briefly, because it connects directly back to something we already discussed earlier tonight. Those early veils were often thick and difficult to see, through which meant a bride truly could not navigate her way safely down toward the altar on her own, particularly across uneven ground or crowded stone floors. She needed someone familiar, someone she trusted physically guiding her there step by step. Some scholars believe this simple practical necessity is at least part of where the custom of a father walking his daughter down the aisle actually comes from, layered quietly on top of everything else. That particular gesture eventually came to represent legal transfer and tender sentiment tangled together in a single walk down a single aisle. Now for the colour that seems to define almost every wedding you and I have ever personally attended: white. And here is where I think most people's assumptions get gently, thoroughly upended. For the vast majority of recorded history, brides did not wear white at all, royal or otherwise. European royalty typically married in heavy gold or silver brocade fabric, chosen specifically to display dynastic wealth, not innocence. Ordinary brides across most of history simply wore their finest existing dress, in whatever colour that happened to be, because very few families could justify spending money on an outfit meant to be worn exactly once. Red, in fact, shows up constantly across historical wedding records in multiple cultures, considered a colour of luck, vibrancy and celebration, rather than anything remotely associated with mourning or danger. The shift toward white traces back to one specific very famous wedding. Queen Victoria of England marrying Prince Albert on the 10th of February 1840. And here is the detail that almost never makes it into the popular version of this story. Victoria did not choose white primarily to symbolize her own purity. She chose it to showcase an enormous flounce of handmade Honiton lace, produced by roughly 200 skilled lace makers in the county of Devon, whose entire trade was collapsing under pressure from cheaper, machine-made alternatives flooding in from the continent. White fabric simply displayed delicate, expensive handmade lace better than any other colour could. Queen Victoria's wedding dress was at its core an act of calculated economic patriotism, dressed up as a fashion choice, a deliberate attempt to save a struggling British industry by giving it the most famous possible advertisement in the entire country. Every queen before her, by contrast, had typically married in heavy silver brocade, the traditional royal choice, precisely because silver, unlike white satin, photographed as wealth rather than simplicity. Before Victoria's wedding settled the matter, English folklore had actually developed an entire rhyming superstition, assigning a different fate to nearly every possible dress colour a bride might choose, warning that green invited shame, that yellow meant embarrassment over your own husband, and that only white and blue carried anything resembling a truly lucky reputation. It is a strange thing to realise that an entire folk tradition once existed purely to help people navigate a choice that within a few decades would stop being a choice at all. Victoria clearly understood exactly what she had started, because she kept wearing that same lace for the rest of her life, mounting it on the gowns she wore to her own children's christenings, and insisting her daughters order Honiton lace for their own weddings, decades later turning one calculated fashion choice into a genuine, lasting royal tradition. What began as a fairly narrow act of industrial rescue ended up almost by accident rewriting what an entire planet now considers the default timeless image of a bride. The purity symbolism we now take completely for granted only attached itself to the colour afterward, spreading through newspapers, fashion illustrations and popular magazines that were more than happy to reframe a savvy economic decision as a romantic, innocent ideal. One biographer, writing shortly after Victoria's wedding, described her as dressed in spotless white, like a pure virgin, meeting her bridegroom language that had nothing to do with Victoria's own stated reasoning, and everything to do with what Victorian readers wanted a young queen's wedding to represent. Once that image caught on, it never really let go. By the end of that same century, white had become the expected, almost mandatory colour for any bride who could possibly afford it, even though for most of history before that single wedding, it had meant essentially nothing at all. So here is a question worth turning over for a second, and I would love to hear your honest answer down in the comments. Now that you know a wedding ring began as a legal contract stamped onto iron, a veil began as either spiritual camouflage or a safeguard against marrying the wrong sister, and the white dress began as a marketing campaign for struggling lace workers in Devon. Does any of that change how you feel about these traditions? Or is it possible for something to keep its emotional meaning completely intact, even after you learn its original, much less romantic origin story? I think honestly it can go either way, and that is sort of the whole point of tonight. Almost nothing about a wedding that we now consider timeless, sentimental, or purely romantic actually started out that way. Somebody, somewhere once had a very practical, very unromantic reason for every single detail, a reason about property or protection or economics or simply making sure nobody married the wrong sibling by accident. And then slowly, generation by generation, we quietly forgot the original reason, and kept only the feeling until the feeling became the whole story we tell ourselves. There is something almost comforting in that if you sit with it long enough. Meaning does not have to be permanent to be real. A ring can start out as collateral against a broken promise, and still end up centuries later on the hand of someone who wears it, because they truly cannot picture life without the person who gave it to them. History does not get a vote on how you feel about your own wedding day. It only gets to tell you quietly where the habit actually came from. But symbols and ceremonies were never the whole picture either, and honestly they were never even the hardest part. Long before any couple reached the point of rings, veils, or carefully chosen dresses, they first had to survive something else entirely. The actual process of courtship, watched, judged, and sometimes openly interrupted by an entire community that considered itself to have a legitimate stake in exactly who ended up with whom. Let's start somewhere truly unexpected, because I promise you did not see this one coming. A freezing farmhouse in colonial New England, where the most efficient way to keep two young people warm enough to actually talk to each other was, by the standards of the time, to put them in the same bed and trust everyone involved to behave. The custom was called bundling, and despite how it sounds, it was not remotely a secret or a scandal at the time. It was practical, openly discussed, and in plenty of Puritan households quietly encouraged by the very parents you would expect to object most loudly. Fuel was expensive, often the single largest household expense a farming family carried through the winter months. Houses were drafty and cold, built quickly and cheaply against a climate that showed no mercy. A young man courting a woman who lived any real distance away often had nowhere comfortable to sit and talk once the family's single fire had burned down for the night, and riding home in the dark across icy roads was neither safe nor practical. So the solution inherited from Dutch and Welsh settlers who had practiced versions of it back in Europe was simple, if a little startling to modern ears. The couple climbed into her bed together fully dressed, sometimes with a wooden board wedged firmly down the middle to keep them apart, sometimes with the young woman sewn snugly into a long fabric bag from the waist down, and they were left to talk through the night while her parents slept quite deliberately in the very same room near enough to hear anything worth hearing. A clergyman named Samuel Peters, writing in 1781, defended the practice at length, insisting it had already been common in New England for more than a century, and arguing with a perfectly straight face that it produced far more chastity than a young couple simply sitting alone together on a sofa. The writer Washington Irving, a few decades later, joked that bundling deserved genuine credit for the population growth of the entire region, since in his words, wherever the custom prevailed, an unusually large number of babies seemed to arrive slightly ahead of any actual wedding. Irving was joking, but only barely. Historians who have gone back through New England church and court records estimate that somewhere between 30 and 40% of brides in the region were already pregnant on their wedding day, which tells you two very different things at once, and I think both are worth holding on to. The wooden board and the watchful parents clearly did not always work as intended. But the system built around bundling was never actually designed to guarantee abstinence in the first place. It was designed to guarantee witnesses. If a young man got a young woman pregnant after an entire winter of chaperoned semi-public bundling, there was no realistic way for him to simply vanish and deny responsibility. Her parents had been in the room night after night watching the exact same relationship develop under their own roof. The whole arrangement, sold publicly as a defense of chastity, was quietly functioning as something closer to an insurance policy, one designed to protect the woman, not the couple's virtue, by making absolutely certain that if a child was coming, everyone in the household already knew exactly who the father was going to be. Bundling eventually faded out, not because anyone proved it was dangerous, but because a new wave of religious revival at the turn of the 19th century decided that watching your daughter share a bed with a suitor, board or no board, no longer looked quite as innocent as it once had. Rising prosperity played its own quiet role too. As New England farmhouses slowly grew larger with more rooms and more fireplaces, the original practical excuse for bundling a simple lack of warm space gradually stopped being true. Once you no longer needed an excuse for two young people to spend a freezing night together, the custom itself started to look less like common sense, and more like something polite society preferred not to discuss at all. Bundling, though, only ever worked as a private family-level solution, something one household could arrange for its own daughter on its own terms. Long before any American colonist nailed a board down the middle of a mattress, an entirely different, far more public system had already been built across Europe to solve the exact same underlying worry. How does an entire community make absolutely certain two people are actually free to marry each other before they go and do it? The answer the church landed on back in the year 1215 was called the reading of the banns. At a major church council that year, church leaders required that any couple intending to marry first have their names announced out loud in church on 3 separate Sundays specifically, so that anyone in the community who knew of a reason the marriage should not happen could step forward and say so before it was too late. Perhaps the bride was secretly already married elsewhere. Perhaps the groom was a closer relative of hers than anyone realized. Perhaps someone else entirely had a prior competing claim on one of them. The banns turned an entire congregation into an informal background check, running for 3 consecutive weeks before a single vow was legally allowed to be spoken. If anyone did raise an objection, church officials could actually require them to put up money of their own. First, a financial bond meant to discourage neighbours from objecting purely out of spite, jealousy, or a simple grudge against the family involved. Now remember Marjorie from the very start of tonight's story, the young woman who secretly exchanged marriage vows with her family's own land agent, with no priest, no church, and certainly no public announcement of any kind, forcing her own family to march her in front of a bishop just to settle the question. That kind of marriage had a specific legal name in the era, a clandestine marriage, and it was precisely the sort of thing the entire system of banns had been created to prevent. The frustrating twist, the one that makes her story even stranger the more you sit with it, is that the banns requirement had already existed in church law for more than 200 years by the time Marjorie made her decision, and it still did not stop her because the underlying rule about spoken vows being binding on their own had never actually been repealed. 2 competing legal principles coexisting uneasily in the very same church for centuries, waiting for someone determined enough to fall directly into the gap between them. That gap did not stay open forever. In England, a law passed in 1753, generally known by the name of the official who pushed it through Parliament, finally closed the loophole for good, declaring that a marriage without properly published banns or a formal license simply was not legally valid at all, full stop, no matter how sincerely 2 people had spoken their vows to each other. One of the more colourful side effects of the old system, right up until that law passed, involved a debtors' prison in London called the Fleet, where a small industry of disreputable, often unlicensed clergymen had built a thriving business, marrying couples on the spot, no banns, no questions, no waiting period for a modest fee, and considerably less discretion than either party probably wanted. By the 1740s, researchers estimate that roughly half of every wedding taking place in London happened in or around that single prison, thousands of ceremonies a year, performed by men who had essentially turned holy matrimony into a cash business conducted in taverns lining the surrounding streets. Eloping couples, desperate parents, chasing runaway daughters, and the occasional outright con artist all passed through those particular doors for decades until Parliament finally decided enough was enough, so the community had its say before the wedding through the banns. But what happened if a couple got all the way to being formally publicly engaged, and then one of them simply changed their mind? In England and America, both for the better part of 3 centuries, the answer was that you could actually sue for it. And I mean that in the most literal legal sense. Courts treated a promise to marry as a binding contract, no different in principle from a business agreement. And if one party broke it without sufficient cause, the other could take them to court and demand real financial compensation for the damage done. One of the earliest recorded English cases back in 1672 involved a woman named Mary Holcroft, who sued a man named Dickinson for breaking their engagement and was awarded £100 in damages. What made that particular ruling significant was not the money itself, but the reasoning behind it. The court agreed that Mary had lost something real and compensable, beyond any property or gifts already exchanged. She had lost the social status of becoming his wife, a loss the law now formally recognised as worth real money on its own. By the height of the Victorian era, these lawsuits had become remarkably common, with roughly 100 cases filed in England alone every single year, splashed across newspapers for public entertainment, complete with courtroom testimony about love letters, broken vows and wounded pride. These cases were rarely simple either. One especially tangled example involved a woman known in the press only as Miss Elkington, who successfully sued a man named Dr. Copeland for breach of promise, only for reporters to later discover that Miss Elkington's own sister had won an almost identical judgment against a different bridegroom just 1 year earlier. Suspicion quickly grew that their own father, a solicitor by trade, had been quietly coaching his daughters through a pattern of engagements designed less around love than around the courtroom payout waiting at the end of it. I do not know whether that particular family ever got caught outright, but I have to imagine every eligible bachelor in their corner of England learned to think twice before proposing marriage to either sister. This was never purely a British phenomenon either. In 1915, an American Army officer and former college football star named Louis Merrillet found himself sued by a young woman named Helen Van Ness, who told reporters he had jilted her after meeting someone else at a social event, and who demanded $20,000 in damages, a strikingly large sum at the time, splashed across newspaper headlines from coast to coast, under exactly the kind of breathless language you would expect from a modern gossip column describing her at various points as a jilted stenographer seeking the redress owed to a broken-hearted woman. Newspapers from Indianapolis to Salt Lake City ran the story for weeks, treating a private heartbreak between two people who had never even lived in the same state as national entertainment, complete with dueling interviews and competing versions of exactly who had wronged whom. Here is where this connects directly back to something I mentioned earlier tonight about the ring itself. Once American states starting around 1935 began abolishing these breach of promise lawsuits, worried they had become a tool for extortion rather than genuine justice, something interesting happened almost immediately afterward. Expensive engagement rings, previously a fairly modest gesture, suddenly became far more common and far more costly. With the courtroom no longer available as financial protection, if an engagement collapsed, the ring itself quietly stepped in to fill exactly that role. Tangible, keepable insurance worn on the hand instead of argued over in front of a judge. Roughly half of American states even today still technically allow some version of this lawsuit, and it is not simply a forgotten relic sitting unused in old law books. A Georgia jury awarded $150,000 in a breach of promise case decided in 2008. A North Carolina jury awarded another $130,000 just 2 years after that. Somewhere in this country right now, tonight, it remains entirely possible to sue an ex-fiancé for breaking your heart and actually collect real money for it, a fact that tends to surprise almost everyone I mention it to. I would love to know your honest reaction to that, actually. Does it strike you as strange that heartbreak once had a genuine enforceable price tag attached to it? Or does some part of you think there was something almost fair about that? A real financial consequence for treating someone else's future carelessly. Bundling monitored the courtship itself. Bands monitored whether the marriage was even legally possible. Breach of promise monitored what happened if somebody's word turned out not to be worth very much after all. Lay all three side by side and you start to see something that never really goes away across tonight's entire story. At every single stage, from the very first conversation to the final vow, somebody besides the two people actually falling in love was standing near enough to have a say in how it turned out. I find it almost funny in a slightly bleak way how consistent that pattern stays no matter which century or country you happen to be looking at. A New England mother dozing lightly in the same room as her bundled daughter. An entire parish listening for 3 straight Sundays for any reason a wedding should not happen. A courtroom full of strangers weighing exactly how much a broken heart was worth in pounds or dollars. None of it left much space for 2 people to simply decide quietly and privately that they wanted to build a life together. Somebody was always listening at the door, whether that door belonged to a farmhouse, a church, or a courthouse. And once you accept that courtship itself was never really a private matter, it becomes a lot easier to understand something else we've not touched on yet tonight. Something that would strike almost anyone listening to me right now as completely unimaginable in their own life. The sheer number of places near us where marrying one single person at a time was never actually the rule to begin with. That sheer number turns out to be almost overwhelming once you actually start counting. Anthropologists who have surveyed cultures across recorded history estimate that a clear majority of human societies, somewhere well over 80% by some counts, have permitted a man to marry more than one wife at some point in their history. Strict lifelong monogamy, the version most of us assume is simply how marriage has always worked, is closer to a minority position across the full span of human civilization than the universal rule we tend to imagine it as. That does not mean most people in most societies actually lived in multiple wife households, since the practice was almost always tied to wealth, land, or status that ordinary families simply did not have access to. But the permission itself, the underlying assumption that one husband could reasonably claim more than one wife, was startlingly widespread. Let me show you 2 versions of this from 2 completely different corners of the world, separated by continents, centuries, and religion, because the differences between them matter just as much as what they share. Inside the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's household operated under its own particular logic, and it is worth understanding the actual mechanics before judging it too quickly. Islamic law technically permitted a man up to 4 legal wives, but in practice Ottoman sultans for centuries avoided marriage altogether, keeping instead a household of enslaved concubines, who bore his children without ever becoming his legal wife. There was a specific, deliberate reason behind this, and it had far more to do with statecraft than with romance or excess. Marrying a woman formally would have given her family political leverage inside the empire, the same kind of leverage we already spent an entire earlier stretch of tonight discussing. So sultans instead relied on slaves with no outside family connections at all, women who owed their entire position and their children's entire future to the sultan alone and to nobody else who might one day expect a favour returned. One especially strict rule governed the system for generations, known simply as one concubine, one son. Once a woman gave the sultan a son, she was expected to stop bearing him any more children, then eventually follow that son away from the capital, once he came of age, to govern a distant province, keeping any single woman's influence permanently limited to whichever province her own child happened to be sent to rule. That entire carefully balanced system, engineered over centuries specifically to prevent any single woman from gaining too much influence over the throne, fell apart because of one former slave from what is now Ukraine, and her story is truly one of the more remarkable political rises in recorded history. It is worth noting, before we go any further, that generations of Ottoman statesmen had built an elaborate, deliberate system explicitly designed to prevent exactly the outcome that was about to happen to them. Her name was Hurrem, though Europeans knew her as Roxolana, captured during a slave raid in her homeland as a teenager, in almost the same general stretch of Eastern Europe, where centuries earlier a Byzantine princess we met tonight had once been sent north to marry a pagan warlord, Hurrem was brought into the imperial harem sometime around the year 1520, purchased as a concubine for the newly crowned Sultan Suleiman. What happened next broke centuries of precedent, one rule at a time. She gave Suleiman a son in 1521, which should have ended her time in his bed under the old one concubine, one son principle. Instead, she went on to bear him 6 more children over the following decade, an outright violation of a rule that had governed the Ottoman court for roughly 200 years, and one that nobody in the palace seemed able or willing to stop. Then in 1533, Suleiman did something that stunned observers across the entire empire. He formally freed Hurrem from slavery and married her, making her his legal wife in front of witnesses, the first time in more than 2 centuries that an Ottoman sultan had married anyone at all. A foreign ambassador present in the city that week wrote home describing the wedding as something completely unprecedented in the entire history of the sultans, an event so far outside normal court behaviour that nobody watching quite knew how to categorize it or what it might mean for the empire's future. Rumours swept through the palace that Hurrem must have used sorcery to secure such devotion, since ordinary explanations like simple affection seemed insufficient to account for a sultan willing to overturn 200 years of precedent for one woman. Hurrem moved out of the old harem entirely and took up residence beside Suleiman himself inside Topkapi Palace, at the literal geographic centre of imperial power, a position no concubine wife or mother had ever occupied before her. From there, Hurrem became something closer to a head of state than a royal consort. Her household stipend eventually reached 2,000 silver coins a day, a figure so far beyond what any previous royal mother had ever received that historians still cite it as concrete proof of exactly how far outside the old rules Suleiman was willing to bend for her. She corresponded directly with foreign rulers, including the King of Poland. She commissioned enormous public works, including a mosque complex, a hospital, and a soup kitchen still standing in Istanbul today. And she opened the door for an entire era historians now call the Sultanate of Women, roughly 150 years, during which the mothers and wives of Ottoman sultans held genuine direct political power over one of the largest empires on earth, often ruling as regents for young or absent sons. I find it almost funny, honestly, that a system built with the specific intention of keeping any one woman from gaining political influence ended up producing one of the most politically influential women in the entire history of the empire, purely because one particular concubine refused to play by the old rules, and a sultan happened to fall completely publicly in love with her. Now let's cross an entire ocean and jump forward roughly 300 years, because the United States built its own version of this story, and it is far more recent, far more American, and far more legally consequential than most people realize. In the 1830s and 40s, a religious movement founded by a man named Joseph Smith began quietly practicing what its members called plural marriage. Smith taught initially only to a small inner circle sworn to secrecy that a righteous man could be sealed to multiple wives for eternity. A doctrine historical records suggest he personally practiced with somewhere between 30 and 40 women, some of whom were already married to other men at the time. His own first wife Emma strongly opposed the practice for years, and Smith kept it hidden from the wider church membership, entirely aware of exactly how explosive the doctrine would prove to be if it became public too soon. After Smith's death at the hands of a mob in 1844, his successor Brigham Young led the movement west into what is now Utah, and made the practice public, and within their own community entirely respectable, framing it openly as a divine commandment rather than a scandal to be hidden. At its peak, historians estimate that somewhere between 20 and 25% of adult members of the church in Utah lived in polygamous households, and roughly 1 in 3 marriageable women in the territory were entering plural marriages rather than conventional ones. The federal government did not take this quietly. Congress passed a series of increasingly aggressive laws throughout the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, specifically targeting the practice, and in 1879 the Supreme Court weighed in directly in a case called Reynolds v. United States. The court ruled unanimously that while the government could never punish someone for their religious beliefs, it absolutely could punish religiously motivated actions that broke a law applying equally to everyone else. It remains to this day one of the foundational cases defining the actual limits of religious freedom in America, still cited by courts and legal scholars more than a century later, all because of a marriage law in a remote Western territory. Enforcement escalated sharply after that ruling. By the late 1880s, federal marshals had pursued more than 1,300 indictments in Utah alone, and an act of Congress in 1887 went even further, formally dissolving the church's legal corporation and seizing more than $50,000 of its property, outright, an amount worth well over $1 million today. Church leaders, including senior apostles, were jailed by the hundreds. Others simply vanished into hiding, moving between safe houses to avoid federal marshals who had made hunting down polygamous households something resembling a full-time occupation across the territory. One of the most striking voices in this entire fight came from inside the practice itself. A woman named Anne Eliza Young, one of Brigham Young's own wives, either his 19th or 27th, depending on which historical count you trust, left him in 1873, and publicly demanded a divorce, an almost unthinkable act for a woman in her position at the time. She spent the following years touring the country as a nationally known crusader against the very system she had once lived inside, packing lecture halls from coast to coast, with audiences eager to hear a first-hand account of what plural marriage actually looked like from the inside of one particular household. She testified in front of Congress, she wrote a best-selling memoir, and she helped build the exact public pressure that pushed lawmakers toward the tougher legislation that eventually followed. It is a striking reversal to sit with, a system originally justified, at least in part, as a form of religious protection and provision for women, ended up producing one of its most effective, most public critics from within its own household, a woman who turned her own marriage into the very evidence that helped dismantle the institution around her. Facing the total collapse of the church's finances and the seizure of its temples, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued a formal declaration in 1890, publicly ending the church's sanction of new plural marriages, a decision he described as coming to him through revelation rather than simple political surrender. Utah finally achieved statehood 6 years later in 1896, a milestone that had been withheld specifically because of this single issue for decades. Even then, the practice did not vanish overnight. Some church leaders kept quietly performing new plural marriages for another 14 years until a second firmer declaration in 1904 finally threatened outright excommunication for anyone who continued closing the door for good within the mainstream church, even though small breakaway groups still practice versions of it illegally in parts of the American West to this day. So here is what I keep turning over, comparing these two systems side by side. The Ottoman harem operated almost entirely as a mechanism for controlling political succession, deliberately keeping women without independent family power, so that no outside faction could gain leverage over the throne. Mormon plural marriage, by contrast, was framed from its very beginning as a matter of religious salvation and eternal family structure, a spiritual obligation rather than a political calculation. Two completely different justifications built on entirely different reasoning on opposite sides of the entire planet, separated by more than 3 centuries. and yet in both systems the actual women involved found their existence structured, limited, and often silenced by rules written for them rather than by them, until in both cases one particular woman found a crack in the system large enough to climb all the way through it and permanently change how the whole story got told. There is something almost wryly satisfying about the shape both of these stories take if you sit with it long enough. Two enormous, carefully engineered systems built by powerful men specifically to control how women move through them, and both systems ended up remembered in no small part because of exactly the women they failed to fully control. Suleiman built an entire harem structure designed to prevent any one woman from gaining influence, and it produced Huram. Brigham Young built an entire household designed around loyalty and religious obligation, and it produced Anne Eliza, who spent the rest of her public life dismantling it piece by piece from a lecture podium. History has a habit of remembering exactly the people a system was built to keep quiet. I would love to know honestly which of these two stories surprised you more, a slave who became one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, or a wife who walked out of her own polygamous marriage and helped take the entire system down from the outside. Let me know down in the comments which one stuck with you longer, because I still find myself going back and forth between them. There is one question neither of these two stories has really answered yet though, and it might be the most uncomfortable one still sitting on the table tonight. In a household built around multiple wives, or in any household at all, what actually happened to a woman once her husband finally died? We have spent this entire night talking about how a woman entered a marriage, how she was married off, watched, valued, and sometimes bought and sold. But death was never really the end of that story either. Because in an enormous number of societies across history, the answer to what came next had almost nothing to do with grief, and almost everything to do with exactly who got to keep her. One of the oldest, most vivid answers to that question is sitting inside a text that a huge number of people around the world still turn to every single week, whether they think of it as scripture literature or simply an old story worth knowing, and I think it deserves a closer look than it usually gets. In the ancient Near East, thousands of years ago, a widow without children faced something bordering on social and economic disappearance. She had no husband to provide for her often, no legal standing of her own, no independent income, and no guaranteed place inside the family that had taken her in through marriage in the first place. If her husband's own relatives decided she was no longer their responsibility, she had essentially nowhere left to turn, no property of her own, no trade, and depending on her age, often no realistic path back to her original family either. The solution that emerged across many cultures in the region, later written directly into biblical law, was called levirate marriage. If a married man died before fathering a son, his brother was expected to marry the widow himself and father a child in the dead man's name, a child who would legally carry on the deceased brother's line rather than the biological father's own. There is a specific story in the book of Genesis that shows you exactly how messy this arrangement could get in practice, and it centers on a woman named Tamar. Tamar married a man named the eldest son of a patriarch named Judah. Died before they had children, leaving Tamar exactly the kind of childless widow the entire levirate system existed to protect. Under the custom of the time, Judah's next son Onan was expected to marry Tamar and father a child on his dead brother's behalf. Onan went through the outward motions of the arrangement, but made absolutely certain deliberately and repeatedly that no child would ever actually result from it, since any son born would inherit in his dead brother's name and share of the family estate rather than his own. The text describes this as a serious offence in its own right, and Onan died shortly afterward as well, leaving Tamar widowed for a second time before she had even really settled into the first marriage. That left Judah with one son remaining a boy named Shelah, and a promise still technically owed to Tamar. Judah told her to wait in her father's house until Shelah was old enough to marry her. Years passed. Shelah grew up. The marriage never happened because Judah, quietly terrified that his last remaining son might die, exactly like his brothers, had simply kept stalling, leaving Tamar suspended indefinitely in a kind of legal limbo, neither free to remarry elsewhere nor actually provided for by the family she was legally still bound to. Here is where Tamar stops being a passive figure in someone else's story and takes control of her own. Disguising herself and positioning herself along a road she knew her father-in-law would travel, she presented herself to Judah as a stranger, without revealing who she actually was. Judah, not recognizing his own daughter-in-law, propositioned her, and in the encounter that followed, Tamar made sure to keep physical proof of exactly who had been with her. His own personal seal and staff items, unmistakably his own. When Judah later learned Tamar was pregnant and still unaware of his own role in it, moved to have her publicly punished for it, she produced his belongings in front of the entire community and revealed the truth. Judah's own verdict, once the full picture became clear, was that Tamar had acted more righteously than he had, because he was the one who had failed to keep his promise to her. I find that ending remarkable, honestly, for a text this old. Tamar was never given a name that history simply forgot, the way so many women in these stories tend to be. She used the only leverage a deeply unfair system had left available to her, and the story itself, even by its own ancient standards, sides with her over the powerful man who wronged her, closing with Judah's own public admission of guilt, rather than any punishment handed down to Tamar for the deception. It is a strange, sharp little pocket of justice tucked inside a text otherwise built almost entirely around the decisions of men. The law itself did leave a small escape hatch for a reluctant brother-in-law, and it is worth knowing simply because of how specific and how deliberately public it was. If a man refused to marry his brother's widow, Deuteronomy describes an actual public ceremony in which the widow was permitted to walk up to him. In front of the town, elders remove the sandal from his foot and spit in his face, at which point he would be known from then on, officially as the family of the unsandaled one. It was designed quite deliberately to make refusing a widow humiliating enough that most men simply would not risk it, and I have to imagine it worked exactly as intended. There are few things more effective at changing a man's mind than the very real threat of being remembered by his entire village for the rest of his life as the guy who lost his shoe. Now, I want to be honest with you about something because it matters for the rest of tonight. This is not a custom safely sealed inside an ancient text, filed away next to other old stories we tell for their moral lessons and nothing more. Related practices, often called widow inheritance, are still documented today in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, practiced by living families in living communities right now, and the modern version of this story carries a weight that the biblical one never had to reckon with. Among the Luo community in western Kenya, and in related traditions across Uganda, Tanzania, Zambia, and several neighbouring countries, a widow is still in some communities expected to be inherited by a relative of her late husband, most often a brother who then takes on responsibility for her and her children, and often for the property she would otherwise have no legal right to keep on her own. In some areas, she's first expected to undergo what is locally called cleansing sex without protection, meant to remove a kind of spiritual impurity believed to cling to her after her husband's death before she can be considered eligible for remarriage at all. Researchers studying the practice in one district of Kenya interviewed nearly 2,000 widows and found that well over half of them had been inherited this way. In a region already carrying one of the highest rates of HIV anywhere in the world, that ritual has turned a custom meant to protect widows into one of the very mechanisms spreading the epidemic further through the exact community it was designed to care for. Aid workers in the region have even documented men who essentially work as professional inheritors, moving from widow to widow across multiple families for a fee or in exchange for property, a role that has earned its own local name. One public health official working on the crisis described it to a reporter as a brutal cycle. A man infects his own wife, and the widow he inherits then dies himself, and 2 more men inherit the women he leaves behind, who eventually become widows themselves, ready to be inherited all over again. Families keep insisting on it anyway, he said, because tradition demands it, even as everyone around them can see exactly what it is costing. Some widows have found ways to resist quietly insisting on protection during the required ritual or refusing inheritance outright, but doing so often means walking away from land housing and community standing that the practice was originally meant to guarantee her in the first place. The very system built to keep a widow from falling through the cracks has become for many of these women the crack itself. There is a completely different fate that met widows in another part of the world, entirely one that solved the same basic question: what happens to a woman once her husband is gone, with an answer that removed the question altogether rather than answering it. In parts of India, a practice called sati called for a widow to end her own life on her husband's funeral pyre, understood by its supporters as the ultimate expression of a wife's devotion, and treated in some communities as a mark of extraordinary honour rather than tragedy. British colonial authorities formally banned the practice in 1829 following years of campaigning by an Indian reformer named Ram Mohan Roy, who had personally witnessed the practice by some accounts, including the death of someone in his own family, and spent years afterward writing and arguing publicly against it, publishing pamphlets that laid out the argument for and against the custom side by side, so that readers could see plainly how thin the justification for it actually was. The ban did not end it completely. In 1987, an 18-year-old widow named Rup Kanwar, married only 8 months before her husband's death, died on his funeral pyre in a village in Rajasthan, in front of a crowd of witnesses who described what happened as her own choice. Journalists and investigators who later visited the village told a considerably more troubling story, describing an atmosphere thick with pressure and intimidation, rather than free will, armed men circling the site, and a community that had already decided before any investigation began exactly what story it intended to tell outsiders. In the days that followed, roughly 200,000 people travelled to the village for a ceremony honouring her death, and the site itself quickly turned into an informal pilgrimage destination, complete with souvenir photographs sold to visitors. Her death led directly to a new national law specifically banning not just the act itself, but any public glorification of it. And yet more than 3 decades later, in the year 2024, an Indian court acquitted the final defendant still facing charges connected to her death, closing the case without a single conviction ever actually standing. Lay these 3 answers next to each other for a moment, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. An ancient legal system that absorbed a widow back into her husband's family through remarriage, a modern practice that does something startlingly similar while carrying a genuine risk of deadly disease, and an entirely different tradition that resolved the question by ending the widow's life alongside her husband's. 3 completely different societies, 3 completely different sets of religious and cultural reasoning, and none of them ever really asking the one question that might have mattered most. Not what happens to her now, simply what do we do with her? What strikes me most, sitting with all 3 of these stories together, is how consistently the widow herself becomes almost a secondary character in decisions made entirely about her own body and her own future. Tamar had to trick her own father-in-law just to be heard at all. A widow in Western Kenya today has to weigh her own health against her only realistic path to housing and land. Rup Kanwar's own family only learned what had happened to her from a newspaper hours after the decision, whatever it truly was, had already been made. 3 different centuries, 3 different continents, and in every single one, the woman at the center of the story had to fight, negotiate, or simply disappear because nobody had actually built a system that started by asking what she wanted. I would love to hear your honest reaction to that comparison down in the comments. Which one of these 3 unsettled you the most, and did any of them actually surprise you? Or had you already heard pieces of this before tonight? I find myself thinking about Tamar the longest, if I am honest, mostly because her story is the oldest of the 3, and yet she is somehow the only one of these women who got to write her own ending into the record, even if she had to trick a powerful man to do it. And once you notice that pattern, the widow's fate always decided by someone else, rarely. By her it becomes almost impossible not to ask an even bigger question about marriage itself. Because a widow's disappearance from her own decisions did not actually start the moment her husband died. In an enormous number of legal systems across history, including one you might be surprised to learn operated well into living memory, right here in the parts of the world. Watching this video tonight, a married woman's independent legal existence effectively ended on her wedding day, long before anyone was ever burying anybody. It did not return until either her husband died or the law itself finally slowly changed its mind, sometimes only after decades of women fighting for exactly that. There is a single sentence written by an English judge in the year 1765 that explains almost everything else we're about to talk about tonight, and I want you to actually sit with the words themselves before I break them down. Sir William Blackstone, the most influential legal writer of his era, described the legal effect of marriage this way, in a textbook so widely used that generations of lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic essentially learned the law from his exact phrasing, memorizing entire passages of it, the way law students today might memorize a landmark court ruling. By marriage, he wrote, husband and wife become one person in the eyes of the law, and the legal existence of the woman is suspended for as long as that marriage lasts, folded entirely into her husband's own identity. This was not poetry. It was not a metaphor meant to describe closeness or devotion. It was an actual literal load-bearing description of how courts in England and later across the United States treated a married woman for roughly 200 years. The system had a name. A married woman was called a feme covert, a covered woman legally absorbed beneath her husband's identity. An unmarried woman, by contrast, was a feme soul, a woman alone, and in the strange logic of this particular legal world, being alone actually came with more rights than being married ever did. A single woman could own property in her own name. She could sign a contract. She could sue someone who wronged her, or be sued in return, standing as her own legal person in front of a judge. The moment she married, every one of those rights simply stopped existing, not gradually, not partially, but the instant the ceremony ended, replaced by a legal status that some contemporary writers openly compared to that of a minor child unable to act fully on her own behalf in almost any formal capacity. Think about what that actually meant in practice for a moment, because it is easy to hear this as an abstract legal idea rather than a lived reality. A married woman could not own the clothes on her own back in any legally enforceable sense. If she worked, and plenty of working-class women absolutely did, her wages belonged by law to her husband, whether he was reliable, absent, generous, or spending every last coin at the nearest tavern. If she inherited money from her own family, that money became his the moment the marriage took effect. If he beat her, she could not sue him, because a person cannot legally sue themselves, and the law considered them quite literally a single legal person. Here is a real example that shows exactly how far this reasoning could reach well past property and straight into a woman's own career. In 1869, a woman named Myra Bradwell passed the Illinois bar examination with flying colours, having studied law for years alongside her own husband, a practicing attorney. She was denied a license anyway. The Illinois Supreme Court ruled that as a married woman, Bradwell could not be legally bound by the ordinary contracts a lawyer needs to form with a client, since her legal existence had already been absorbed into her husband's under coverture. When Bradwell pushed her case all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1873, she lost there too, 8 votes to 1. One justice writing separately to explain his own reasoning argued that the timidity and delicacy naturally belonging to women left them unsuited for the demands of civil life, describing the harmony of a household as fundamentally at odds with a wife pursuing any career separate from her husband's own. There is a remarkably striking twist buried in this particular story, though. Myra Bradwell had already personally helped draft 2 of Illinois' own laws expanding property rights for married women, years before her own case reached the courts. She had spent her career writing the exact kind of legislation chipping away at coverture for other women, while coverture itself was simultaneously being used to keep her out of the courtroom. She was finally admitted to the Illinois bar in 1890 and granted the right to argue before the United States Supreme Court itself, 2 years after that, roughly 2 decades after the same court had ruled against her. Reform, when it finally came, arrived slowly and almost always for reasons more complicated than simple justice. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, writing the founding document of the American women's rights movement in 1848, put the whole situation about as bluntly as language allows, describing a married woman as civilly dead in the eyes of the law, stripped of any right to property, even to the wages her own 2 hands had earned. Mississippi passed the first married women's property law in the country in 1839 largely to protect family wealth, specifically enslaved people held as property from being seized to cover a husband's debts. Fairly uncomfortable origin story for what later generations remembered as a triumph for women's rights. New York followed in 1848, the same year as the Seneca Falls Convention, driven in large part by working women in textile mills, who had organized for years demanding that their own wages actually belong to them. England did not catch up until 1870, and even then only partially finally extending full property rights to married women in 1882. It took the better part of a century spread out unevenly across an entire ocean simply to establish that a married woman was allowed to own the things she already owned before her wedding day. And here is the part of tonight's story that I think surprises people the most, because most of us assume that once property rights were settled, the rest of coverture quietly followed along behind it, chipped away piece by piece until nothing remained. It did not work that way at all. There was one particular corner of this old legal doctrine that survived almost completely untouched for another full century after married women had already won the right to their own wages, their own property and their own signatures on a contract. The doctrine traced back to an English judge named Sir Matthew Hale, writing in the 1600s, whose reasoning was published after his death and went on to shape the law for the next 300 years. Hale argued that a husband could not by definition be found guilty of raping his own wife because by the act of marriage itself, a wife had given permanent irrevocable consent that she was legally incapable of ever taking back for as long as the marriage lasted. That single sentence, written by one judge more than 3 centuries ago, functioned as active law across the United States all the way into the second half of the 20th century, quietly surviving every other reform we've just discussed almost entirely intact. South Dakota became the first American state to remove that exemption entirely in 1975 through a bill introduced by a state senator named Grace Mickelson. who managed to strike the relevant language from state law without attracting much national attention at all. Nebraska followed within the same year. Even after the law changed, actually enforcing it proved to be its own separate battle, one fought inside individual courtrooms rather than settled by any single vote in a legislature. In 1978, an Oregon man named John Rideout became the first person in the country to stand trial for raping his wife while the two of them were still living together under the same roof. His own defense attorney argued to the jury that marriage itself functioned as ongoing standing consent, an argument straight out of Hale's 17th century reasoning restated almost word for word in an American courtroom nearly 300 years later. The jury acquitted him. It took until 1984, in a case called People v. Liberta, out of New York, for a court to formally strike down the entire marital exemption as unconstitutional on its face. The judge who wrote that decision, Sol Wachtler, put the reasoning as plainly as I have ever seen a judge put anything, stating that a marriage license should never be treated as a license for a husband to force himself on his wife without consequence. Even after that ruling, state-by-state reform crawled forward at its own uneven pace, some states closing the exemption completely, others leaving smaller carve-outs behind for years afterward, and it was not until 1993 when North Carolina became the very last state to act that marital rape was finally fully treated as a crime everywhere in the United States 118 years after South Dakota had taken the very first step. England was not far ahead, if it was ahead at all. The House of Lords did not formally abolish the same marital exemption under English law until 1991, only 2 years before North Carolina finally closed the American gap for good. So if you are watching this from somewhere in Europe tonight, rather than the United States, please do not assume this was purely an American problem with an American timeline. The exact same legal fiction traced back to the exact same English judge held on almost exactly as long on both sides of the Atlantic. I want you to actually sit with that timeline for a second, because I think it is easy to let a date like 1993 slide past without registering what it really means. That is not some distant sepia-toned corner of history filed away next to powdered wigs and horse-drawn carriages. That is within the living memory of most of the adults watching this video with me right now, and well within the adult lifetime of plenty of people who are still alive, working and voting today. Somebody's own mother in a great many households was already a fully grown married adult before this particular protection existed everywhere in the country she called home. For the majority of American history, a wife's own body under the law was never fully considered to be entirely her own. Here is a question worth sitting with, and I would love to hear your answer down in the comments. Does it surprise you more that this exemption existed for centuries in the first place, or that it took until 1993 within a single lifetime to finally shut the loophole everywhere in this country? I go back and forth on which fact unsettles me more honestly, and I suspect the answer says something a little different about each of us, depending on how old we are and whose own histories we happen to be measuring that timeline against. What strikes me most, looking back across property rights and consent as two separate battles rather than one single fight, is how uneven the whole process turned out to be. A married woman in most of America could legally own her own house nearly a full century before she could fully legally refuse her own husband. Ownership of things came first. Ownership of herself came agonizingly, almost unbelievably last. It is a strange backward order for a society to solve its own problems in protecting a woman's furniture and her bank account for generations before it ever got around to protecting the one thing that should have mattered more than either. I find myself wondering honestly what future generations will eventually look back on from our own moment. The exact same way, some ordinary assumption sitting quietly in plain sight right now, that nobody currently watching this video has fully questioned yet. We have spent this entire night walking through property capture, childhood, wedding night, sale symbols, courtship, multiple wives and widowhood, and every single one of those threads leads back to the exact same starting point. A woman legally absorbed into someone else's identity the moment she said her vows, her body, her wages, and eventually even her own consent folded into a single legal person that was never really considered to be her. Marjorie, all the way back at the beginning of tonight, had to drag a bishop into the argument just to prove her own marriage was real. It turns out that even after the marriage itself was settled, an entire further set of battles was waiting on the other side of it, some of them not finished until well within our own lifetimes, which finally brings us to the one question worth asking after everything we've covered tonight. If marriage really did begin as property and consent really did take this long to fully arrive, what actually changed? And when did the story we're living inside right now finally start to look different from the one we've spent tonight uncovering? The first real crack in that old system came from the most unlikely possible source, and I think you are going to enjoy the irony of this one as much as I did when I first came across it. In 1969, the governor of California signed the very first no-fault divorce law in the entire country, a law that finally let a couple end a marriage simply by agreeing it was over, without either person having to stand in front of a judge and publicly accuse the other of cruelty, betrayal, or abandonment, the way the law had required for centuries before that. That governor was Ronald Reagan, a man who would go on to become one of the most conservative presidents in American history, and by his own later admission a man motivated at least partly by his own experience. Reagan's first wife had divorced him back in 1948, using exactly the kind of adversarial fault-based system he would later dismantle, and he apparently never fully got over the process. Decades afterward, he reportedly called signing that bill one of the biggest regrets of his entire political career, even as it went on to reshape divorce law across the entire country within 15 years. It is a strange thing to sit with. The very same law that finally let ordinary people, men and women, both walk away from a marriage without a public trial over blame, was signed by a man who spent much of the rest of his life wishing he never had. Think back for a second to everything a couple in earlier centuries had to do just to end a marriage they could no longer bear. A public sale in a livestock market, a rope around a wife's neck in front of a curious crowd, a hearing in front of a bishop arguing over words spoken years earlier, an act passed through an entire national legislature at a cost most families could never dream of affording out of reach for anyone who was not already wealthy. By the end of the 1970s, in most of the country, that entire elaborate machinery centuries in the making had been quietly replaced by two people simply agreeing on paper that it was over, no marketplace, no bishop, no act of parliament required at all. But the moment that I think actually marks the clearest turning point, the one that finally fully separates where marriage started from where it eventually landed, happened decades later, and it did not begin with the law at all. It began with a hospital room. In Ohio, a man named John Arthur was dying of a degenerative disease that would eventually take away his ability to move or speak entirely. He and his partner, James Obergefell, had been together for more than 20 years, building an entire shared life in a state that had never once allowed them to formally call it a marriage. Knowing how little time they had left, the two of them chartered. A small medical jet flew to Maryland, one of the few places where their marriage would actually be legally recognized, and were married on the airport tarmac, unable even to leave the plane, John too weak by that point to do much more than lift his hand for the ceremony, while a family member officiated over the two of them in the cramped cabin. They flew home to Ohio immediately afterward, back into a state that still refused to see them as anything other than strangers under the law. and Ohio, where they had built their entire life together, refused to recognize that marriage as real, meaning that when John finally died only months later, the state intended to list him on his own death certificate as unmarried, erasing with a single administrative decision the relationship that had defined the last 2 decades of his life. James Obergefell sued. His case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, and in June of 2015, the court ruled by the narrowest possible margin that the right to marry could no longer be limited to opposite-sex couples anywhere in the country. Same-sex marriage became legal in all 50 states on that single day. Here is the detail I think about the most out of everything in this particular ruling, and I promise it connects directly back to almost everything we have spent tonight talking about. In writing the court's opinion, the justice tasked with explaining the reasoning walked through the entire history of marriage as an institution, tracing it directly back to exactly the kind of arrangement we spent our very first hour together unpacking. A contract once settled by parents over political, religious, and financial concerns, formalized under old legal doctrines that folded a married woman's entire legal identity into her husband's, leaving her with no independent voice inside her own household. The opinion names that old doctrine directly in plain language, no euphemism required. It calls it by its actual historical name, coverture, the exact same word we used earlier tonight, cited in a modern Supreme Court ruling, as the very thing this new decision was finally fully leaving behind the last visible thread connecting a wedding on an airport tarmac in 2013, all the way back to a bishop's courtroom in 1469. I find something quietly remarkable in that. After everything we have covered together tonight, capture property, child brides sold, wives, silence consent, erase legal identities, the highest court in the United States sat down in 2015 and explicitly deliberately named the same history we have spent this entire night walking through, and then used it as the very reason to expand who gets access to marriage rather than restrict it further. The story that began with a father handing his daughter's ownership to a husband in front of witnesses ended, at least for now, with a court declaring that marriage belongs to whoever chooses it freely, regardless of what that choice looks like. It is worth pausing on how differently people actually talk about marriage today compared to almost every single story we have covered tonight. Ask people now why they got married or why they want to, and the answer almost never mentions land alliances, dowries, or family obligation. Surveys of American adults conducted in recent years consistently find that love and companionship top the list of reasons people give for marrying far ahead of financial stability, family pressure, or any of the practical calculations that would have dominated the conversation in absolutely every single story we have walked through tonight. People are also marrying later than at almost any point in recorded history, well into their late 20s on average, now closer to the pace of ordinary medieval villagers than to the child brides and teenage political pawns we spent so much of tonight discussing. The whole shape of the decision has quietly flipped. For most of human history, marriage was the thing that happened to you, arranged around you, negotiated over your head. Now, for an enormous number of people reading this sentence back to themselves in their own heads right now, it is closer to the opposite. One of the most personal, most freely chosen decisions a person ever makes in their entire life. Let's take one final walk back through everyone we have met tonight, because I think it is worth seeing them all standing together side by side before we shut the book on this one. Marjorie fighting her own bishop for the right to marry a man her family considered beneath her, and losing her family anyway even after she won. Eleanor abducted from her own castle, and punished with a second imprisonment for surviving it. Holan taken from the road while travelling home from her own wedding, and the granddaughter of that same violence eventually taken again a generation later the cycle repeating itself almost exactly. Margaret Beaufort giving birth at 13 years old to a line of kings that would go on to rule for over a century, turning a childhood she never chose into 5 decades of real hard-won power. A 14-year-old queen watched by an entire nation for 7 years, waiting for a wedding night that refused to arrive, blamed publicly for a silence that was never really hers to control. Wives walked into English marketplaces and sold for a few coins and a length of rope, some of them fighting for the sale, others fighting against it. A slave who became an empress in all but title, and a wife who walked out of her own marriage and helped bring the entire system down behind her. A widow who tricked her own father-in-law simply to be heard at all, and was declared more righteous than the powerful man who wronged her. A woman who helped write the very laws that expanded rights for other married women, while being denied by those same courts the right to practice the profession she had trained her whole life for, every single one of them in her own century with her own tools pushed against a system that treated her as something closer to property than to a person with her own say in her own life. None of them fixed it alone. None of them lived to see the ending we get to see tonight, sitting here warm and safe listening to their stories as history, rather than living through them as daily reality. But every single one of them moved the line forward by exactly as much as her own moment in history allowed her to, whether that meant a single defiant sentence in front of a bishop, a lecture tour across an entire country, or simply surviving long enough to tell someone else the truth of what had happened to her. I think that is the actual story underneath everything we've covered together tonight more than any single ring veil, wedding night or legal ruling on its own. Marriage did not evolve because one law changed everything overnight, the way it can sometimes feel when you glance at a single date on a timeline. It changed because thousands of individual people, most of them never remembered by name, never given a statue or a chapter in a history book, kept refusing to accept that the version of it they were handed had to stay exactly the way they found it. Progress, it turns out, rarely arrives as one dramatic moment. It arrives as an accumulation of thousands of much smaller, much quieter refusals stacked one on top of another across centuries until the weight of all of them finally tips something over. If there is one thought I would love for you to carry with you as you drift off tonight, it is this. The version of marriage most of us now take completely for granted. Two people choosing each other freely as equals, answerable to no father, no bishop, no market, no legal doctrine erasing either one of them into the other is remarkably new. It is not the ancient unchanging tradition it often gets described as at weddings in old movies, in the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about how things have always been. It is closer to the newest chapter in a very, very old story, one that spent most of its length being about land alliances and control, and only very recently, within the lifetime of people still very much alive today, started being primarily about the two people actually standing at the altar. And the fact that it exists at all, the fact that you or someone you love gets to choose a partner freely rather than have one assigned, is the result of an enormous number of people, most of whom you will never learn the names of, refusing to accept less than that for the people who came after them. That is not a small thing to sit with right before sleep. Somewhere behind every quiet, ordinary wedding happening somewhere in the world, tonight there is an invisible chain stretching all the way back to a bishop's courtroom, a marketplace in London, a bedroom in Norfolk, a hospital room in Ohio, each link forged by someone who simply refused to accept the version of the story they had been handed. Thank you so much for spending tonight with me and with all of these women across all of these centuries and continents. Writing these stories for you is truly one of my favourite parts of every single week, and knowing that so many of you choose to fall asleep to them of all the things you could be doing with these quiet hours still means more to me than I think I know how to properly say. If their stories kept you company through everything we covered tonight, if even one moment tonight, one name, one detail, one small act of quiet defiance is still sitting with you as your eyes finally drift shut, then this entire evening did exactly what I hoped it would do. I have so many more stories like these waiting for you tucked away in notebooks and half-finished drafts, other names history nearly let slip away, other quiet refusals that change more than anyone at the time ever realized they would. I would love nothing more than to share the next one with you very soon on another night just like this one. Until then, get some rest, take care of yourself and the people you love, and I will see you again next time.